On a peaceful Sunday morning, just as the sun began to rise over the Hawaiian island of Oahu, many were preparing for a relaxing day off, unaware that their world was about to be shattered. Far to the northwest, beyond the horizon, a formidable Japanese strike force approached. Comprising 6 aircraft carriers, this fleet had sailed in secret across the vast Pacific. Its mission was as bold as it was clear: to deliver a surprise attack on the United States Pacific Fleet, anchored at Pearl Harbor. Before the attack, sentiment about the United States' involvement in the war was somewhat mixed. Most Americans were strongly in favor of remaining isolated, believing it was not in the country's best interest to engage in yet another war on the other side of the globe. Others were outspoken about the nation's lack of foresight, arguing that if Hitler's fascist Reich was not actively opposed, it was only a matter of time before it threatened the United States directly. The attack on Pearl Harbor precisely marked that turning point. But it was not the knock at the door many had anticipated. It was more akin to a battering ram, shattering the illusion of peace in the minds of Americans. This shift in mindset became the country's official stance when President Franklin D. Roosevelt declared his famous Day of Infamy speech, in which he declared that the United States of America would go to war with the Japanese Empire, thus thrusting the country into World War II. Around August 11th of 1942, over 6 months after the attack on Pearl Harbor, an American soldier named Private First Class C. Miller and his reconnaissance team would be captured at Makin Atoll in the Allies' efforts to retake the island from the Japanese Empire. Nearly a week later, Corporal Roebuck and the rest of the 2nd Marine Battalion, also known as Carlson's Raiders, would rescue Private Miller shortly before his execution at the hands of a Japanese officer. Afterwards, they battled their way through the village, where they would eventually escape on boat. In doing so, the father of the then 9-year-old Alex Mason would suffer life-threatening injuries, earning him a Purple Heart. A month later, a Soviet soldier named Private Dmitry Petrenko would find himself a victim of Germany's continued assault on the city of Stalingrad. As he laid bleary-eyed and surrounded by the corpses of his fellow soldiers, a faint whisper of hope would present itself in the form of a man named Sergeant Viktor Reznov. Though patient, Reznov wouldn't hesitate to task Dmitry with assassinating the German general Heinrich Amsel, given that he couldn't carry out the task himself due to his injured hand. After tailing General Amsel through the ruins of Stalingrad, they would encounter fellow Soviet soldiers attempting to assault a German communications depot. After doing so, the conflict would flush General Amsel from his command post, allowing Dmitry an opportunity to end his life. However, in doing so, Reznov and Dmitry's location was revealed, forcing them to escape German fire by jumping into a river. Near the end of 1942, President Roosevelt would authorize the formation of the now infamous Manhattan Project in an effort to create an atomic bomb before the Germans. After its formation, a group of disillusioned Soviet spies, collectively codenamed Perseus, would steal confidential plans from the Los Alamos National Laboratory. Around that same time, as the war in the East began to favor the Allies, Adolf Hitler, as well as a scientist named Dr. Frederick Steiner, would begin looking into alternate weapons of war. What they would soon develop was an extremely volatile gas called Nova 6. On June 6th of 1944, as part of Operation Overlord, the Allied forces would launch an all-out invasion on the beaches of Normandy, France. This gamble would later become known as D-Day, a historic achievement for Allied forces and a turning point in the war, as now Germany was no longer seen as the favorable victor on the Eastern Front. A few months later, Operation Stalemate would take place on Peleliu Island. On September 15th, Private Miller and the 1st Marine Division would begin their assault on the shore. Their mission was to cripple the Japanese supply network by taking an airfield. After a rocky start, they would eventually puncture the Japanese front lines, destroying the Japanese tanks and shifting the tide of the battle. Shortly after, Sergeant Sullivan is killed by a Japanese soldier, leaving Roebuck to lead the assault as a newly appointed sergeant. Alongside the 5th and 7th Marine Battalion, Private Miller and the 1st were able to take out the Japanese anti-aircraft crews and secure the airfield. Afterwards, they pushed through the Japanese trenches in an effort to secure their mortar pits. The next day, in a final attempt to secure the island, they would begin an all-out hunt for the remaining Japanese men. After pressing through the remaining trenches and caves, the Marines were successful. Peleliu would become Allied territory. On April 3rd of 1945, Black Cat Squadron VPB-54 would destroy critical Japanese merchant ships and military aircraft just south of the island of Okinawa. This would further set back the Japanese Empire, looking to maintain their chokehold on the Pacific, as well as create opportunities for future Allied operations. About 2 weeks later, in the German countryside of Seelow Heights, Dmitry Petrenko would find himself once again on the verge of death at the hands of the Germans. That is, until Reznov alongside the 3rd Shock Army would arrive to save him. They would then fight their way through German forces, destroying their tanks in the process. Afterwards, using tanks themselves, they would secure a German train which they planned to use to travel to Berlin. 5 days later, Dmitry and the rest of the 3rd Shock Army would arrive at the outskirts of Berlin. After fighting their way through German forces and securing an asylum, they would continue to carve a path to the heart of Germany. Inside Berlin, the Red Army would continue their crusade until pushed underground. Inside the tunnel, they would continue to fight before the tunnel was intentionally flooded by the Germans to kill off the invading Soviets. However, Dmitry would once more cheat death in surviving the flood, all thanks to Reznov. Reznov would then rally the remainder of the Soviet forces before beginning what they had hoped to be their final assault on Berlin. After fighting their way through the war-torn ruins of Berlin, the Red Army made their way inside the Reichstag. Inside, the Red Army continued to escort the Soviet flag to the top of the Reichstag. Dmitry would be given the honor of planting it, though a final German soldier would shoot him directly beforehand. Reznov immediately killed the soldier and escorted Dmitry to the apex of the building where he planted the flag, securing Berlin as Soviet territory. With this, it would become clear to all that the war in the East was all but over. Nobody knew this more than Adolf Hitler himself, who, shortly after learning of the Soviets' triumph in Berlin, would commit suicide by shooting himself in the head. About a week later, on May 8th of 1945, the war in Europe would officially come to an end. On May 14th, amidst the cold rain and dwindling morale, the American assault on Okinawa was in desperate need of a win. Private Miller and the 1st would soon hand them one after torching and blasting their way through the last of the Japanese bunkers. Almost 2 weeks later, in a final push to secure victory on the island, the 1st Marine Division would begin their assault on Shuri Castle. After a tough battle, defined by the loss of countless brave men, the Japanese Empire occupation of Shuri Castle, and eventually Okinawa, came to an end. Nearly 2 months after securing Shuri Castle, the Allied nations would give Japan an ultimatum in the form of the Potsdam Declaration, in which the Allies would state that if Japan did not surrender, they would face prompt and utter destruction. About a week and a half later, on August 6th of 1945, a B-29 bomber would drop an atomic bomb named Little Boy over the Japanese city of Hiroshima. Refusing to surrender, a second bomb, named Fat Man, would be dropped over the city of Nagasaki just 3 days later. In total, a roughly estimated 200,000 mostly innocent Japanese lives were lost in these attacks, serving as a permanent reminder of the horrific power these weapons and those who wield them hold. A little over a month later, on September 2nd, 1945, Japan would officially surrender, thereby putting an end to the Second World War. Though the war was over, artifacts of its influence would continue to linger in the minds of both Allied and Soviet leaders. On October 29, 1945, one of these artifacts would be uncovered when General Nikita Dragovich and his lapdog Lev Kravchenko would order the Third Shock Army, including Dmitri and Reznov, to find a Nazi scientist named Dr. Frederick Steiner. After finding him, as well as his stash of Nova 6 aboard a German submarine, Dragovich, who for years had held disdain for Reznov, would then betray his own men, killing Dmitri using Nova 6. Meanwhile, British forces, who were also in search of Nazi research, would begin to close in on the submarine. Dragovich, Steiner, and Kravchenko would escape with samples of Nova 6, leaving the few remaining Soviet soldiers, including Reznov, to fend for themselves. Shortly after fighting their way off the submarine, it sinks into the ocean. Reznov, being one of the few survivors, is then captured by the Soviets once again, where he's taken to the infamous Soviet prison named Vorkuta. Just a few short years after World War II, the United States and the USSR began a stalemate struggle for influence across the developing world. The United States, as well as Western Europe, were determined to prevent the Soviets from spreading communism further into Europe, a stance cemented by Winston Churchill's Iron Curtain speech in 1946. This speech highlighted the division between Europe and the USSR, as well as laid the foundation for President Truman to create the Truman Doctrine, pledging American support to countries resisting communist insurgencies. This policy, along with previous events, marked the beginning of a global ideological struggle that would later become known as the First Cold War. Amid escalating tensions between the United States and the USSR, and the urgent need to streamline and unify the fragmented intelligence organizations, President Truman signed the National Security Act of 1947 into law. This landmark legislation was pivotal in uniting U.S. national security institutions, leading to the creation of the Central Intelligence Agency. Alex Mason was born and raised in the then U.S. territory of Alaska. Due to its proximity to the Soviet Union, the looming threat of a Soviet invasion or nuclear strike was far more relevant to him than it was for most Americans. This became a key factor in shaping his strong anti-communist beliefs and further drove him to develop his tactical skills in the harsh Alaskan wilderness alongside his father. Over the years, Alex became highly proficient in cold weather combat, as well as an exceptional marksman. By the age of 20, he had become the youngest Wimbledon Cup winner of his generation. 5 years later, in 1958, after an outstanding term of service with the Marines, Captain Alex Mason was recruited into the CIA. In that same year, amid the growing threat of a Soviet invasion, President Eisenhower approved a CIA program called Operation Greenlight. This program would have a nuclear device planted within every major European city, serving as the ultimate countermeasure against a Soviet invasion. On September 12, 1960, a young girl named Jane Harrow would be forever changed when a stranger wielding a firearm forced his way into her family's home. Her mother, desperate to protect Jane, commanded her to hide under her bed. If she had listened, perhaps that night would have gone differently, but instead, her fear and curiosity got the best of her. When Jane opened the door, it drew her mother's attention at just the wrong moment, causing her to get shot by the intruder. Jane's father rushed to Jane, pushing her into her closet to shield her from the bloodshed. However, just moments after doing so, he was mercilessly killed as well. Jane watched in silence as the intruder confirmed her parents' death before leaving the house. While her relatives and the public assumed this to be a simple home invasion, Jane, even as a child, knew better. She would grow up thinking obsessively about that night, about the fact that it was no coincidence her parents were CIA operatives. Determined to learn the truth, Jane would follow in her parents' footsteps, setting her sights on the CIA. After being recruited into the CIA, Alex Mason proved to be an exceptional asset, demonstrating not only his prowess as a skilled soldier, but also his ability to be a team player. He regularly formed strong bonds with his fellow combatants, but none was stronger than his friendship with Frank Woods. Together, they made an effective team, with Mason often taking initiative, while Woods knew exactly how to channel Mason's intensity and rein him in when necessary. Everything changed, however, when they, alongside Joseph Bowman, were recruited for Operation 40, a covert mission to assassinate the Cuban dictator Fidel Castro. On April 17, 1961, Operation 40 commenced. Mason, Woods, and Bowman traveled to the Bay of Pigs, where they learned of Castro's whereabouts from a Cuban rebel named Carlos. Shortly after, a group of Cuban militants arrived, triggering a gunfight. As local police flooded the streets, Op 40 stole a car and used it to reach Castro's plantation. After battling their way to Castro's room, Mason put a single round in the head of the infamous dictator. Unaware that they had just killed a body double, they moved to extract at Castro's airfield. During the escape, a convoy of trucks blocked the runway. In a selfless act, Mason leaped out of the plane, climbed into an anti-aircraft cannon, and used it to clear the runway, allowing Woods and Bowman to escape. Immediately after saving his friends, Kravchenko yanked Mason out of the cannon and knocked him out. When Mason regained consciousness, he found himself face to face with Dragovich, Kravchenko, and the real Fidel Castro, who presented Mason to Dragovich as a token of their newly formed alliance. Given Mason's elite status within the CIA and his superior marksmanship, Dragovich saw a perfect opportunity to turn Mason against his own government. Under full military escort, Mason was taken to Vorkuta. There, he remained in solitary confinement for weeks on end. Once released into the labor camp, he met with Reznov. Given the fact that both of them have bold personalities, it's not surprising that their initial contact immediately turned into a physical brawl, resulting in both of them being thrown into solitary confinement for about a month. Afterward, their friendship began to blossom, with them eventually seeing each other as brothers. This was likely when Dragovich and Dr. Steiner began their attempts to condition Mason to assassinate President John F. Kennedy, though the exact timing of this event remains unclear. Initially, their efforts to indoctrinate Mason seemed unsuccessful, likely due to his abnormal willpower and stubborn nature. After much effort, Dragovich decided that Mason was a lost cause, but instead of killing him, he decided to let him rot in Vorkuta. This was precisely when Reznov decided to use the programming already implanted within Mason to fulfill his own vendetta, to kill Dragovich, Kravchenko, and Steiner. Over the next 2 years, Mason, Reznov, and the other inmates worked diligently on an 8-step escape plan. Finally, on October 6, 1963, the plan was ready to execute. Step 1 had them securing the keys of a guard. Step 2 was their ascension from darkness. Step 3 had them raining fire on the guard towers. Step 4 had Reznov unleashing the horde of prisoners. Step 5 was their skewering of the winged beast that threatened their plan. Step 6 had Mason wield the fist of iron. And Step 7 had them all raise hell on the prison camp. With these steps complete, Mason and Reznov began their final step toward freedom. However, like Reznov had been keen to say at the beginning of their escape, victory could not be achieved without sacrifice. And Reznov was willing to make that sacrifice as much as anyone else. To complete Step 8 and ensure Mason's freedom, Reznov diverted the prison guard's attention away from the train Mason was escaping on, ultimately sacrificing his own life to guarantee Mason's survival. Sometime over the next few weeks, Mason returned to the United States, where after performing extensive studies on his psyche, the CIA concluded that his time in Vorkuta did not prevent him from performing his duties within the CIA's Special Activities Division. However, for both his and his teammates' safety, Mason was assigned a handler, someone who is as badass as he was skilled, a man named Jason Hudson. After being cleared for duty, Mason was invited to the Pentagon, where he was to be briefed on his next critical assignment, which coincidentally was to kill Dragovich. At the heart of the Pentagon, Mason was escorted to the Situation Room, where President John F. Kennedy briefed him further. In this briefing, Mason's dormant programming to kill JFK would attempt to take hold, though wouldn't fully take control. About a week later, a Soviet double agent named Grigory Weaver was captured in his attempt to infiltrate a Soyuz launch facility in Baikonur, USSR. Before his capture, he was able to provide critical intel to the CIA, including the knowledge that Dragovich was at the facility. Using this intel, the CIA tasked Mason, Woods, Bowman, and Brooks with infiltrating the facility to stop the Soyuz launch and assassinate Dragovich. Directly after their arrival, Mason and Woods would learn of Weaver's capture. Unable to help, they would watch as Kravchenko carved out Weaver's left eye. After donning disguises and meeting with Bowman and Brooks, they would help rescue Weaver directly before his execution. Alongside Weaver, they fought their way to the control room for the Soyuz 2 rocket, but couldn't abort the launch in time. This forced them to resort to Plan B. Using a prototype Valkyrie rocket launcher, they destroyed the rocket before it could reach orbit. Afterwards, the squad moved deeper into the facility to eliminate surviving members of the Ascension Group, former Nazi scientists collaborating with the Soviets, as well as hunt down Dragovich. They eventually cornered Dragovich, who was escaping in his limo, and destroyed it. But rather than confirm his death, Mason was convinced by Woods that he couldn't have survived. This assumption would soon be proven incorrect. On November 22, 1963, President JFK was assassinated while riding in a presidential motorcade through Dealey Plaza in Dallas, Texas. While official reports concluded that Lee Harvey Oswald was the sole assassin, photo evidence suggests that Alex Mason had some involvement, likely due to his indoctrination at Vorkuta. Later that day, Vice President Lyndon B. Johnson would be sworn in as president aboard Air Force One. 2 years later, in 1965, President Johnson would authorize a series of bombing campaigns in Vietnam known as Operation Rolling Thunder. A year later, fearing political backlash, Johnson would double down on this decision by more than doubling US ground troops in Vietnam. Around the same time, a contingency plan known as Fractured Jaw began implementation in South Vietnam. This plan, much like Operation Greenlight, had a series of nuclear weapons placed in key locations in South Vietnam. On January 21st of 1968, due to the escalating tensions in the Vietnam War, Alex Mason was recruited to Woods' Studies and Observation Group, or SOG unit, in Vietnam. Alongside Hudson, Mason regrouped with Woods at a Marine base in Khe Sanh. Their objective was to travel to Hue City. However, after the Northern Vietnam Army, or NVA, attacked a nearby airfield, Mason and Woods felt they were better suited to stay and defend the base. 5 days later, Russell Adler and Lawrence Sims discovered Perseus's involvement in Vietnam when NVA forces attempted to steal a Fractured Jaw nuclear warhead from Firebase Ripcord. While unsuccessful, the very fact that it could have happened became a strong argument against Fractured Jaw, which would be abandoned just a month later. On January 31st, Hue City, Vietnam was overrun by a collection of NVA and Viet Cong soldiers in the still of night. 2 days after, Woods' SOG unit would finally travel to Hue City to retrieve a dossier that had been acquired by a Soviet defector who was killed during the attacks in Khe Sanh. After arriving, Mason split from Woods and Bowman to retrieve the dossier. He did so himself, however, thanks to Reznov's brainwashing, he imagined Reznov as the defector. With the dossier in hand, Mason and the SOG unit would advance to the LZ, where they extracted shortly before a bombing run hit their location. 5 days later, Mason and the SOG unit found themselves stranded in Vietnam after their helicopter was shot down. They traveled upriver, stealthily taking down Viet Cong soldiers before Mason and Swift dropped into a rat tunnel. After Swift was killed, Mason stumbled upon Kravchenko's hideout, where he found 2 key pieces of intel. One detailed the development of Nova 6, as well as the personnel working on it, while the other mentioned a crashed plane in Laos carrying Nova 6. 5 hours later, using the intel acquired by Mason, Hudson and Weaver tracked down a man named Dr. Clark in Kowloon City, Hong Kong. After torturing him, they confirmed that he was working for Project Nova under the supervision of Dr. Steiner. But before they could learn more, Dragovich's men raided the building, forcing Hudson and Weaver to escort Clark to a more secure location. Once they were safe, Clark informed them of a Project Nova development center on Mount Yamantau within the Ural Mountains. Directly after sharing this, Clark blew up his own lab to keep Dragovich's men from taking his research. Minutes later, just before Clark was able to tell Hudson and Weaver what the numbers meant, he was shot in the head by one of Dragovich's men. Left with no other options, Hudson and the CIA began preparations to travel to Mount Yamantau in search of Dr. Steiner. 2 days later, Mason and the SOG unit traveled to Laos to secure the aforementioned crash site. At the site, they found the location of Kravchenko's secret compound, as well as a distinct lack of Nova 6, which they assumed had been taken by Dragovich. Afterwards, Soviet soldiers ambushed the group, capturing Mason, Woods, and Bowman. A week later, with the assistance of Captain Mosley's SR-71 surveillance crew, Hudson and Weaver's team infiltrated the Yamantau complex. After cutting the base's internal communications, they rappelled down to the Comstat building, clearing it of personnel, as well as disabling its data processing capabilities. Afterwards, an RPG fired from a Soviet soldier triggered an avalanche, pushing the team to base jump to the foot of the complex. There they are contacted by Dr. Steiner, who tells them about Dragovich's plan to release Nova 6 across the United States using sleeper cells embedded within key positions across the country. To activate these sleeper cells, he planned to broadcast a series of numbers in a specific sequence that only they could decipher. With only 36 hours until the sleeper cells would be given their final orders, and with Dragovich relentlessly cutting his loose ends, Dr. Steiner informed Hudson of his location at Rebirth Island. Directly afterward, Steiner activated a self-destruct countdown, forcing Hudson and his team to escape before the base was destroyed. The very next day, in Laos, Mason and Woods were forced to watch as Bowman was brutally killed by a Soviet soldier shortly after insulting him. Afterwards, Mason and Woods were forced to play Russian roulette for the soldiers' amusement. By tracking the bullet's placement within the revolver's cylinder, Woods and Mason were able to use the revolver to kill their captors and escape imprisonment. Using a helicopter that was stationed outside, Mason and Woods traveled to Kravchenko's secret compound, where Mason would once again hallucinate Reznov's return. Compelled by Reznov's programming, Mason moved to kill Kravchenko. After reaching him, Kravchenko knocked Mason to the ground and threw Woods to the side. He then threatened to kill Mason before Woods stabbed him. Kravchenko, not willing to die without at least taking them with him, pulled a pin on a grenade, which forced Woods to tackle him through a window to save Mason. With Kravchenko seemingly dead, Mason's focus shifted to Steiner, whom he would quickly learn resided at a Project Nova manufacturing facility nicknamed Rebirth Island. Shortly after Mason had left to hunt down Steiner, Kravchenko woke up to find both he and Woods were injured but still alive. Being the first to awaken, he captured Woods and sometime afterward took him to the Hanoi Hilton POW camp in Vietnam, where he would remain for the next 4 years. On February 23, 1968, both Mason and the CIA independently traveled to Rebirth Island. Mason snuck aboard the island on a transport truck, using anything at his disposal to reach Steiner. Simultaneously, Hudson, Weaver, and many other CIA operatives, likely including A.R.E, attacked the south side of the island using APCs. After being ambushed with Nova 6, Hudson and Weaver donned hazmat suits to reach Steiner's lab. Shortly after Mason's rampage through Steiner's lab, Hudson arrived to see the aftermath of his brutality. He and Weaver then witnessed Mason executing Steiner, which they attempted to stop by smashing the window. For Mason, his brainwashing made him believe that Reznov was the culprit behind Steiner's death, while in reality, he was the true executioner. Moments after Mason killed Steiner, Hudson and Weaver broke through the window and subdued Mason. Afterwards, they concluded that without Steiner, Mason was now their best shot at deciphering the number sequence. Meanwhile, at an undisclosed location on Rebirth Island, A.R.E tortured and interrogated Viktor Stitch Kuzmin, uncovering that he was the head of Nova 6 production. Afterwards, in a brutal act of retribution for what had been done to Weaver, A.R.E carved out Stitch's eye. On February 25, 1968, driven by the prospect of World War III, Hudson and Weaver took Mason into Room 9 of an NSA laboratory. After what had been hours of interrogation by Hudson and Weaver, Mason's brainwashing finally began degrading. Fed up with Mason's insistence that Reznov was behind his actions, Hudson revealed himself to Mason. As Hudson began to release Mason in an act of trust, Mason punched him and escaped into the larger lab, where his psyche unraveled as he questioned reality itself. After Hudson caught up to him and quite literally knocked some sense into him, he finally came to the realization that Reznov was indeed not real. However, the numbers were. and if he didn't find out what they led to, the US would be all but wiped out. With a clearer mind, Mason was able to translate the number sequences, learning that Dragovich's broadcast station was on a ship named the Rusalka. The next day, Mason, Hudson, and Weaver led an all-out assault on the Rusalka in the Gulf of Mexico. After the initial air assault, they moved to sweep the ship on foot. Once cleared, they submerged underneath the ship to assault a secret Soviet supply station on the ocean floor. At the heart of the station, Mason disabled the numbers broadcast shortly before being attacked by Dragovich. With Hudson serving as a distraction, Mason was able to pull Dragovich through a hatch, where he then strangled him underwater. Moments later, the station began to crumble. Mason and Hudson barely managed to swim to the surface, where they were met by Weaver as well as a fleet of ships belonging to the United States Navy. 4 years later, in 1972, Woods found himself alone in what could only be described as hell. Of the 18 total prisoners in his group at the Hanoi Hilton, 17 of them had died, leaving him as the sole survivor. Compelled to live on, Woods escaped the camp, where he was then rescued and taken back to the United States. While the rest of the world may have narrowly avoided its end, some, like a young Nicaraguan boy named Raul, were about to see their world shattered. On December 23, 1972, on what should have otherwise been a festive day, Managua, Nicaragua was hit by a magnitude 6.3 earthquake. In the devastation, over 5,000 lives were lost, and countless families were displaced from their homes. One of these was the Menendez family, who were left with nothing but the clothes on their backs. For the young Raul, this would serve as a reminder that, above all else, loss was the most potent weapon. This absolute would come to define Raul, when just 6 months later, on June 19, 1973, a fire would leave his sister Josefina crippled. As Raul held his sister's charred body, surrounded by hellish flames, he would attempt to commit suicide. But with a single touch, his sister reminded him that she was not yet gone. Raul, inspired by her bravery, mustered the courage to carry them out of the building. Later, Raul would learn that this fire was caused by an American in search of an $11,000 insurance claim. This was more than enough to change Raul forever. From then on, he would work to shift the balance of the world, to show those who had everything what loss truly felt like. To this end, he envisioned a single day of judgment that would strike at the heart of the entire world. On December 29, 1980, Soviet surveillance of Jason Hudson would reveal Operation Greenlight to the USSR. Seeing this as a threat to national security, the USSR would immediately send Perseus to collect the nuclear device staged in Berlin. On New Year's Day 1981, Perseus successfully stole the high-yield neutron bomb intended for use in Operation Greenlight from Berlin. With no clear leads on who was responsible, Hudson and the CIA launched a massive manhunt. Nearly 2 weeks later, Mason, Woods, and Adler were dispatched to Amsterdam to locate Arash Kadivar and his second-in-command, Qasim Javadi, the leaders of an Iranian terrorist organization. In Amsterdam, Mason and Adler met with a local police chief who informed them that Qasim was holed up in a nearby apartment. With only 15 minutes to infiltrate the building, Mason, Adler, and Woods swiftly raided the building. After a foot chase across several rooftops, they cornered Qasim at a dead end. Mason interrogated him, and under pressure, Qasim revealed that Arash was meeting an informant at an airfield in Trabzon, Turkey. 18 hours later, the team began their search for Arash at the airfield. Simultaneously, a Soviet informant accompanied Arash to the airfield, carrying sensitive intel about personnel connected to Perseus. After a brief conversation, Arash executed everyone inside the vehicle to cull his fellow competition. Mason, Woods, and Adler witnessed the carnage and quickly identified Arash. Mason took a shot, but it hit a soldier in front of Arash, allowing him to escape. Using an RCXD, Mason grounded the plane Arash was attempting to escape on. They then pulled Arash from the wreckage, where he revealed that Perseus was the mastermind behind everything. After Adler executed A.R.E, the team scoured the airfield for survivors, discovering a single survivor inside the vehicle A.R.E had arrived in. About a week later, Hudson, Adler, Mason, and Woods met with President Ronald Reagan to discuss the threat Perseus posed on the United States. In this meeting, President Reagan indirectly approved Adler's proposal to turn the Soviet informant they had found into an agent of the United States. Over the next 5 weeks, Adler and the CIA used methods derived from MK Ultra and likely similar to those used on Alex Mason to give the Soviet informant the new identity of Bell. During this, they implanted them with memories of a shared history with Adler and Sims in Vietnam. To manifest these memories, a trigger phrase was agreed upon, that phrase being, "We got a job to do." On February 23rd, Adler's team, including Elazar, Lazar, Azule, Helen Park, Sims, Woods, Mason, and Bell, all gathered inside a CIA safe house in West Berlin. To extract information about Perseus from deep within Bell's psyche, Adler made Bell recount their time in Vietnam. This process stirred up their fabricated memories, leading them to believe they had found encrypted intel all the way back in Vietnam, though in reality they were discovered with it at the airfield in Turkey. By leveraging their latent decryption skills from their past life, Bell deciphered the intel, which revealed a list of names, most of which had no connection to Perseus. The following day, Park managed to link one of the names, Anton Volkov, to Perseus. With his position hard to pin down, the team decided to go after Franz Kraus, one of Volkov's information couriers. After sneaking into East Berlin using the U-Bahn, Bell and Adler decided to tail Kraus to a nearby bar. Inside, Bell met with one of Hudson's Berlin contacts named Greta. Together, they listened in on Kraus while awaiting Volkov's appearance. After a minute, a group of officers informed Kraus that he was being tailed, forcing Bell to escape through a bathroom window. Bell was eventually able to regroup with Lazar and Park, who were spying on Kraus outside his apartment. With Lazar and Park providing surveillance, Bell managed to sneak inside Kraus's apartment and uncover a hidden room. After planting a tracker in Kraus's briefcase, they found Greta was being held hostage. Just as they found this, Kraus knocked Bell out cold. They eventually awoke inside a warehouse, confronted by both Kraus and Volkov. Just as Volkov was about to execute Bell, Adler's team broke in through the skylight, saving Bell and pressuring Volkov to flee. Bell and the others pursued Volkov and eventually captured him. With Volkov in custody, they learned that Perseus had successfully smuggled the nuclear device through East Berlin. Further investigation of Volkov's intel pointed to a classified facility deep within the wilderness of Ukraine. Uncertain of the facility's purpose, Bell, Woods, Adler, and Mason were dispatched to investigate. A few days later, Bell and Woods infiltrated the facility while Adler and Mason stood by for extraction. Inside, Bell and Woods discovered that the location was being used as a Spetsnaz training course, designed to simulate the environment of your stereotypical American town. The two decided to raid the Soviet trainees as they made their way to the center of the building. At the heart of the facility, Bell hacked into a computer terminal and uncovered information about Operation Greenlight. Suddenly, the building went into lockdown, forcing Bell and Woods to escape using an APC. Afterwards, Woods, Adler, and Mason confronted Hudson, who revealed the truth about the stolen nuke and Operation Greenlight. It then became clear to them that if they failed to stop Perseus, the Soviets could detonate the nuke and the entire world would blame the United States. Among the documents found at the facility, Park had uncovered information about an excavation taking place at the old Nova 6 facility on Mount Yamantau. Unclear of the exact reason behind this, Adler sent Mason and Woods to investigate. About a week later, with the assistance of a KGB double agent named Belikov, Mason and Woods infiltrated Mount Yamantau. During the operation, Mason fell from a zipline, cutting him off from Woods. Once they regrouped, they discovered an old mainframe that the Soviets were trying to excavate. To both prevent them from doing so and gain some information themselves, they connected the mainframe to Belikov's helicopter and airlifted it out of the building. After days of analyzing the mainframe, the CIA discovered that Perseus had been searching for the names of sleeper agents involved in Dragovich's planned Nova 6 attacks. Hudson requested the list of names, but to his dismay, Perseus had erased them from the mainframe. This meant the only remaining location where the names might be found was the Lubyanka building, the headquarters of the KGB. They knew from Belikov that the files they wanted were stored deep below the building inside a nuclear defense bunker. With the only access to it being through a high-security elevator, they planned to use Belikov to gain entry. Meanwhile, at the safe house, Bell managed to decrypt the previously collected intel for Operation Chaos. On March 7th, Woods and Mason would complete this operation by eliminating Robert Aldrich, a Perseus spy who had defected from the CIA. A couple days later, inside the Lubyanka building, Belikov was contacted by Adler. Afterwards, he was summoned to a meeting with high-ranking Soviet officials, including Gorbachev, Zakhaev, and Kravchenko. There, they discussed security concerns within the ranks of the KGB before he was released. With tensions rising, Belikov hurried to assist Adler before he was caught by his superiors. Eventually, Belikov was able to obtain a keycard with the credentials needed to access the elevator leading to the bunker. He then let Adler and Bell into the building via the furnace room, where they eliminated a group of guards to acquire uniforms. Disguised in uniforms, Bell and Adler moved through the building, only pausing for a security check, during which Belikov narrowly saved them from being caught. Inside the bunker, a shootout erupted, forcing Adler and Bell to fight their way to the archives. After copying the sleeper agents' names to a floppy disk, they made their way out of the bunker. At the elevator, they equipped themselves with heavy ballistic armor and LMGs. As walking armories, they fought their way through the building, where they escaped in a car. After analyzing the list of names, the CIA narrowed their search to a single individual named Theodore Hastings, the only person who was both a sleeper agent and involved in Operation Greenlight. With this information, the CIA placed a surveillance detail on him, enabling them to track Hastings directly to Perseus when he was summoned. Soon enough, Hastings was called to a vacant government facility in the Cuban countryside. Around this same time, Bell successfully managed to cross-reference the evidence they had collected for Operation Red Circus. On March 12th, Mason and Woods carried out the operation by executing Major Vladimir Rudnik, a Perseus operative who had been planting agents throughout Europe. The day after, Adler's team infiltrated the government facility in Cuba in search of Hastings. Once inside, Bell accessed the CCTV footage, which revealed the location of a makeshift lab where the nuclear device was being held. After fighting their way to the room, they discovered the nuke lying dormant alongside Hastings, who was bleeding out. Curious as to why Perseus had left the nuke behind, Park questioned Hastings. With his dying words, Hastings revealed that Perseus had forced him to reverse engineer the detonation codes to gain access to every nuke connected to Operation Greenlight. After Hastings died, Lazar, Park, and Bell made their way to the roof, where they held their position, awaiting extraction via skyhook. Just as Bell hooked themselves up, an RPG was fired at their position. Upon regaining consciousness, Bell had only a few seconds to decide who to save between Lazar and Park. Under pressure, Bell chose Park, abandoning Lazar in Cuba. The next day, Adler, Sims, Park, and Bell returned to the Berlin safe house. Due to their lingering injuries, Bell was placed on a gurney, where, in their helpless state, the team decided to induce Bell's long-dormant memories of Perseus using psychoactive chemicals. After administering an injection, Adler would inform Bell that they had a job to do, which triggered their false memories of Vietnam. Despite their efforts, they failed to extract useful information from Bell and continued to repeat the procedure. Cooperative or not, Bell's mind grew increasingly disillusioned with their false memories, while becoming more aware of reality, leading to intriguing side effects within their false environment. Eventually, Bell became aware enough to break Adler's programming altogether, but not before recalling one final piece of crucial information: the location where Perseus planned to broadcast the detonation signal. With his programming now practically useless, Adler decided to reveal the truth to Bell, hoping it could get them to trust him enough to reveal the signal's location. Despite the constant string of lies and betrayal, Bell would decide to tell them the truth, revealing that the signal would be broadcast from the radar facility in the Slovetsky Islands. The next day, Adler's team, backed by a naval fleet, arrived at the Slovetsky Islands. Upon landing, a convoy of armored vehicles were deployed, which the team used to approach the radar facility. During their approach, an EMP was detonated above the base, providing them with just enough time to infiltrate and disable the anti-aircraft guns that fortified the base. With the guns destroyed, a series of carpet bombings laid waste to the entire facility, stopping the transmission and burying Bell in debris. Afterward, Adler would rescue Bell from the rubble and take them to the edge of the island. There, he stated that what he did to Bell was strictly for the greater good, and that they were a hero. Though, all heroes must make sacrifices. Sensing the tension in the air, Bell would raise their gun just as Adler did. As both of them leveled their guns, a shot rang out in the air. From what we know, Adler survived this encounter without sustaining any major injuries, while Bell's condition remains unclear. It's likely that following Bell's death, Adler, for reasons unknown, visited a remote facility in eastern Kentucky called Cosper Solutions. In reality, Cosper Solution was a front for a CIA research division named Advanced Technologies and Applications. Head of this division was a clandestine branch of the CIA known as the Pantheon. It's around the same time that a man named William Calderon volunteered to take part in Project Cradle, being dubbed Test Subject Case 1 by Pantheon. While the specifics behind what Project Cradle intended to do are mostly unclear, it's implied to have been some sort of super soldier program that used a chemical compound to enhance the strength, speed, and senses of those who took it. While they did end up creating a compound that accomplished this goal, the extremely dangerous hallucinogenic side effects made the compound unviable for its intended use. Eventually, these side effects, along with the rigorous experiments conducted by Pantheon, led Case 1 to become increasingly paranoid and sabotage the project itself, contaminating the facility with the same compound that was used on him. Following the leak, Pantheon would pivot their research, turning the dangerous compound into an equally dangerous bioweapon. Uncomfortable with this prospect, Daniel Livingston, the deputy director of the CIA, would dissolve the Pantheon branch of the CIA. Despite this, Pantheon would live on in secret inside the agency, slowly rising up the ranks until they could enact their ultimate goal of dismantling the CIA altogether. Meanwhile, Case 1 was recovered by the CIA, where he immediately began rehabilitation. It's then that he was given the nickname Case, and put into the field like any other highly skilled operative. 2 years later, in 1983, the man known as Perseus, head of the organization with the same name, succumbed to cancer. Yet, like the figures who had assumed the role before him, his legacy would endure, this time through Stitch, who would work to preserve the legend of Perseus. On January 20th, 1984, Stitch, in a clear move to get Adler's attention, led a raid on the CIA safe house in West Berlin. There, he planted evidence indicating that his next target was the Pines Mall in New Jersey. The following day, Adler discovered the evidence that was left for him. Fully aware that it was a trap, but unable to ignore the threat, he decided to pursue Stitch. The next day, Adler and Woods led a team of operatives to storm the Pines Mall. They immediately discovered barrels marked as Nova 6, but before they could investigate further, Stitch and his men ambushed them, capturing Adler in the process. Afterwards, Adler was transported to Laos, where he underwent intense interrogation and brainwashing at the hands of Stitch. Months later, on April 19th, a rescue team led by Woods was dispatched to Laos to find Adler. Eventually, Woods' team located the site where Adler had been tortured, only to find they were too late to rescue him. They also uncovered that the Nova 6 threat had been a ruse all along, designed by Stitch to lure them in. After numerous interrogations of Stitch's men, they learned that Stitch and Adler were headed to Verdansk. Over a month later, on June 2nd, Wraith and Knight infiltrated Mount Yamantau and stole Dragovich's number sequence. Wraith contacted Stitch to confirm her suspicions about the numbers, then nuked the complex. Afterward, Stitch revealed that his plan was to use Dragovich's numbers to manipulate not just individuals, but entire nations. 1 week later, Woods' team successfully rescued Adler from captivity. Stitch, however, remained unconcerned, as Adler had already been brainwashed using the numbers. His next focus was on the numbers broadcast, which was being disrupted by US satellites. To solve this problem, Stitch instructed Wraith to make the call, signaling her to contact Jackal, who was in South Africa. About 2 weeks later, Jackal infiltrated the Jumpseat satellite ground station, forcing a technician at gunpoint to deorbit US satellites to specific coordinates. The satellites crashed down in Verdansk and Algeria. Adler and his team quickly secured the Algerian crash site, with Adler secretly retrieving the data recorder before falsely claiming it had been destroyed. Sometime later, Adler planted bombs in the tunnels beneath Verdansk. Meanwhile, Hudson and Woods, growing increasingly suspicious, met to discuss the possibility that Adler had fallen under Stitch's influence. Given Adler's erratic behavior, they concluded that he was likely compromised. A few days later, Hudson and Mason confronted Adler in Room 9, interrogating him about his actions in Verdansk. During this, Mason attempted to break Adler's brainwashing using the same methods once used on him. Meanwhile, in Verdansk, Stitch and Fuse successfully disarmed one of Adler's bombs, which triggered the others to detonate, devastating Verdansk's Tovorsk district. About 2 weeks later, on August 19th of 1984, Stitch would visit Perseus's grave, during which Adler, alongside Woods, Hudson, and Mason, would arrive to confront Stitch. At first, Stitch would attempt to use the numbers to control Adler, but they failed to take effect. Adler then demanded to know Perseus's whereabouts, with Stitch revealing to him that Perseus had died the year prior, and that Perseus was not a single person, but an ideal, an identity assumed by the strongest of them when they're most needed. In the ensuing confrontation, Stitch would reveal that his numbers broadcast worked just before Adler shot and killed him. With Stitch dead and the threat of Perseus dormant, Mason, Woods, and Adler would go their separate ways. Both Adler and Woods would presumably continue working for the CIA. Mason, on the other hand, would retire, traveling back to Alaska where he would begin the next chapter of his life. Not as a soldier, agent, or operative, but as a father to his then 5-year-old son named David. In the time after June 19, 1973, Raul and his father, Jose Luis Menendez, would decide it was time to start fresh. In their fractured world, they would find an effective method of doing this was to sell narcotics. While initially this was only meant for their own survival, they quickly found themselves garnering more money than they had ever seen in their entire lives. Naturally, they leveraged this to gain the most powerful thing money can buy: power. Born from this power was the Menendez cartel, which throughout the early 80s would become practically unstoppable. In an attempt to undermine their power, the CIA would assassinate Jose Luis Menendez. Enraged by this, Raul Menendez would seek justice for his father's death by swearing vengeance on the United States. Later, around June of 1986, a CIA team headed by Frank Woods was sent to Angola to intervene in their civil war. During their mission, the team was captured by the Menendez cartel. Wanting to know what the CIA had on him, Menendez tortured Woods' team. In the end, Woods was the only remaining survivor. To break Woods even further, Menendez would lock him and his dead teammates inside of a shipping container where he was left to starve. The next day, while Alex Mason was watching over his son, David, Hudson arrived to inform him of the situation with Woods, who they had found using a spy satellite. Though he promised David he would never go back to the military, Alex couldn't forgive himself if he didn't at least try to save his best friend. With that, Alex Mason was back to working with the CIA. On July 2nd, Mason and Hudson in search of Woods traveled to Angola. There, they assisted Jonas Savimbi, the leader of the National Union for Independence of Angola, or UNITA, in their fight against the MPLA, the Communist Party of Angola. In exchange for their help, Savimbi gave them the location where Woods was being held captive, which was on a transport barge 2 miles north of their location. After clearing the barge, they opened a storage container where they found Woods on the brink of death. After a helicopter sank the barge, the group moved inland, where they planned to use a radio station to call Savimbi for extraction. Inside the station, Mason confronted Raul Menendez, who he quickly held hostage after a group of Cuban soldiers entered the room. With a gun to his head, Menendez pulled the pin on a grenade. After a stalemate struggle in which Mason shot out Menendez's eye, the grenade detonated. With the entire village after them, Mason, Woods, and Hudson moved toward the beach. Once there, they loaded Woods onto a Soviet helicopter that Zavimbi had hijacked. In doing so, Hudson was shot by a Cuban soldier, who Woods immediately shot in retaliation. Over the next 2 months, the CIA would obtain intel that Menendez was distributing guns in Afghanistan to capitalize on their war with the Soviet Union. To gather more intelligence on Menendez, the CIA sent in Hudson, Woods, and Mason. On September 5th, in the Khost province of Afghanistan, Woods and Mason met a Chinese contact of Hudson's named Tian Zhao. In this meeting, Zhao was given a shipment of weapons in exchange for guidance to the leader of the Mujahideen, Mullah Rahman, who supposedly had intel on Menendez. They traveled to his location on horseback, where they found Hudson and Rahman conversing about the imminent Soviet invasion. Once the invasion began, Woods and Mason found themselves on the front lines, battling against wave after wave of Soviet soldiers and heavy vehicles. In the final wave, Mason narrowly escaped being run over by a tank, which he then attempted to destroy using a mortar. However, just as he was about to do so, Kravchenko revealed himself to be inside. Despite the sporadic return of his flashbacks, Mason still came out on top by destroying the tank and capturing Kravchenko. Naturally, Woods began to torture Kravchenko for his knowledge of Menendez. In doing so, they learned that he was in Nicaragua. Meanwhile, Mason fought the urge to execute Kravchenko and fulfill his dormant programming. However, before he could do so, Woods took the opportunity to enact his own revenge by putting a bullet in Kravchenko's skull. Directly afterward, the Mujahideen, including Rahman, surrounded the men, revealing their secret alliance with Menendez. After knocking out Mason, Woods, Hudson, and Zhao, they dumped their bodies in the middle of the desert. At this point, it's not entirely clear what happened next. It's entirely possible that the group could have been saved by a CIA rescue team, or maybe they even somehow made it out themselves. Regardless of either, if you were to ask Alex Mason what happened, he would have sworn that they were saved by none other than Viktor Reznov. After the US operation in Afghanistan, Panama's President Manuel Noriega was paid $1 million by the United States in exchange for the precise location of Menendez. True to his word, Noriega agreed to assist in capturing Menendez alongside Hudson, Mason, and Woods. On September 26th, the operation began as Noriega's soldiers stormed into Menendez's villa. Believing Menendez had been secured, the team initiated their raid on the village. Unbeknownst to them, Menendez had watched in horror as his sister Josefina was assaulted by the soldiers. In a fit of rage, he stabbed one of them before being subdued with a sleeping agent. Minutes later, Menendez awoke to find Noriega, who had betrayed his own men, revealing his true intentions to aid Menendez. Furious, Menendez beat Noriega before launching a violent rampage throughout the village to rescue his sister. During this, Woods, Hudson, and Mason spotted Menendez's rampage, leading to a race to the villa. Eventually, Hudson split from Woods and Mason, who went underground. Menendez soon encountered Hudson just as Woods and Mason reached the main building. When Woods saw Menendez, he attempted to shoot him, but Mason intervened. In a fit of anger and frustration, Woods tossed a grenade, which Mason tried to deflect, unintentionally directing it inside of Josefina's room. Official Panamanian reports claimed that both Josefina and Menendez died in the explosion, but this was only a half-truth. While Josefina was indeed killed, Menendez survived, confirmed when he resurfaced in Panama the following year. By 1989, President George H.W. Bush, frustrated by Noriega's schemes, authorized a covert invasion of Panama known as Operation Just Cause. During this operation, CIA agents Alex Mason and Frank Woods were tasked with capturing Noriega, codenamed False Prophet, and planting false evidence to discredit him. Around the same time, Hudson became paranoid about the possibility of deep-rooted corruption inside the CIA. While he was unable to uncover any evidence of this, he would inform Adler of his suspicions, trusting him to find the truth while he handled the invasion of Panama. On December 19th, just hours before the invasion, Woods and Mason met at Mark McKnight's house in Panama, where they discussed the plan for Noriega's capture. A few hours later, on December 20th, Operation Just Cause commenced. Before or around the same time, Menendez would kidnap David Mason. Using David as a hostage, he would force Hudson to direct Woods and Mason to lead Noriega to a secondary checkpoint where he was to be used in a prisoner exchange. After arriving, Woods and Mason would split up. Mason would be led to a warehouse where he was captured by Menendez. Woods would follow Noriega to a balcony overlooking that very same warehouse. Woods, .50 caliber sniper in hand, would watch as a man who Hudson claimed was Menendez was brought out from the warehouse. Once in the open, Hudson, under the direction of Menendez, ordered Woods to take the shot. As Woods approached the body, a gnawing sense of unease settled over him, as if he had been deceived. Noriega's uneasy silence only deepened his suspicion that something was terribly wrong. Sure enough, when Woods pulled the bag off the body, his worst fears were realized. He had just killed Alex Mason, his best friend. Shocked and enraged, Woods spun to kill Noriega. Before he could act, a blast from Menendez's shotgun shattered his knee, sending him to the ground in agony. As Woods tried to crawl toward his weapon, Menendez coldly shot his other knee, leaving him crippled for life. Despite the pain, Woods once more reached for his gun, only for Menendez to let him grasp it briefly before stepping on his hand and knocking him unconscious. When Woods awoke, he found David and Hudson bound and held captive. Menendez, savoring his vengeance, forced Hudson into an impossible choice: to kill Woods, David, or himself. For a moment, Hudson pleaded for mercy, but then, realizing that Menendez had already made up his mind to kill him, he embraced the inevitable. Menendez, in a cruel mockery of mercy, shot off Hudson's knees, ripped the pendant from his neck, and slit Hudson's throat with it, just like he had planned to do to himself over 20 years ago. He then turned to Woods, vowing that he would know the true depth of absolute loss. He then leaned to whisper to David, telling him that like Woods, he would be spared if only to prolong their torment, so that one day they might see him change the world. Before leaving, Menendez ominously predestined that when David saw his pendant again, when the memory of that night resurfaced, David would come after him. But this was not something Menendez was afraid of. In fact, he invited it, because by that time, it would already be too late. Following that night's events, Woods would be taken to the Walter Reed National Military Medical Center. Soon after his recovery, Daniel Livingston offered Woods the opportunity to remain with the CIA, running operations instead of working in the field. Woods accepted this offer, though he remained adamant that he was going to raise David. On November 9, 1989, after weeks of public protests and pressure for reform, East Germany unexpectedly announced that its citizens could freely cross into West Berlin. Thousands gathered at the Berlin Wall, overwhelming the border guards and creating a spontaneous celebration as people began tearing down the wall themselves. This historic moment symbolized not only the reunification of Germany, but the end of the First Cold War. In the decades after her parents' death, Jane Harrow continued her goal of finding the truth behind the events of that night. Starting with her acceptance into the CIA, Harrow would climb the ranks of the agency, eventually gaining access to her parents' records, only to find they had been scrubbed from the CIA's archives. With no more leads to follow, yet vindicated knowing that the CIA were indeed hiding something, Harrow was unsure of how to move forward. That is, until Pantheon would reveal themselves, showing her exactly what she wanted to see: hard evidence that Russell Adler was her parents' killer. From then on, she vowed allegiance to Pantheon, seeing them as the righteous liberators the world needed to escape the corrupt clutches of the CIA. Following the events at Panama, Adler would continue to investigate the CIA, quickly finding that Hudson was correct in suspecting the CIA had been compromised. Investigating further, Adler found that the group was called Pantheon, a paramilitary force that had been working in secret for nearly a decade. To stop Adler from discovering the extent of their influence, Pantheon forged evidence indicating that Adler had been given a large sum of money from Raul Menendez shortly before Operation Just Cause. Their plan was successful, and everyone, except for Woods himself, assumed Adler was Menendez's mole inside the CIA. With nowhere left to go, Adler fled to Bulgaria, where he took refuge in an old KGB safe house called the Rook. By the summer of 1990, A.R.E had become a trusted figurehead of Pantheon, so much so that she was given the task of securing the cradle from the Advanced Technologies and Applications building in Kentucky. Afterwards, the bioweapon was taken in secret to the underbelly of Vorkuta, which had been converted into a biolab sometime in the 80s. Using this lab, a man named Matvey Gusev, under the direction of A.R.E, would convert the cradle from a makeshift bioweapon into a fully fledged weapon of mass destruction in just 6 short months. When the enhancements were complete, Pantheon and A.R.E continued their plan, which by January of 1991 was to give the infamous Iraqi dictator Saddam Hussein samples of the cradle to frame him for Pantheon's planned attacks on the United States. On January 17th, after months of diplomatic efforts and military buildup, the US-led coalition launched Desert Storm, an operation that intended to drive Iraqi forces from Kuwait following Iraq's invasion in 1990. Around this same time, Adler, who had been following every lead he could for the past 10 months, would get into contact with Saeed Alawi, the Minister of Defense of Iraq. Seeing as Alawi wanted a way out of the war, he agreed to give Adler any information he could about Pantheon and their dealings with Saddam Hussein in exchange for safe passage to Europe. A few days later, Alawi, under the assumption that he was contacting the CIA, would be told to leave Iraq. In response to his exodus, CIA operatives Troy Marshall, Jane Harrow, and Case would be given orders to capture Alawi on the Iraq-Kuwait border. On January 23rd, Marshall, Harrow, and Case successfully captured Alawi before he could leave the country. In doing so, Alawi revealed Pantheon's presence in Iraq. After fighting through Pantheon forces, the team arrived at the extraction point, only to find Adler leveling his gun at Alawi to keep him from spreading his knowledge about Pantheon. After killing Alawi, Adler was apprehended by Marshall and Harrow, but not before asking them to pass on a message to Woods. Bishop takes Rook. 3 days later, Marshall and Harrow were interrogated by Livingston about their actions in Kuwait. While this interrogation was being carried out, Adler was taken to a remote CIA black site under Capitol Station in Washington, D.C. Following the interrogation, Woods and Marshall would meet with Harrow to ask her to cover for them while they followed up on a lead. 3 days later, Woods, Marshall, and Case arrived at the Rook, where, just as Woods had suspected, Adler had set up camp to investigate Pantheon. Picking up where Adler left off, Case contacted a woman named Savati Sev Dumas in Avalon, while Marshall went to Munich to find Felix Newman, an ex-Stasi tech expert he planned to utilize to find Adler. In Avalon, Case was contacted by Sev, who had him take out a smuggler named Tanik. Afterwards, they moved to kill a crime boss at a nearby restaurant. After successfully infiltrating the restaurant, Case made his way to the safe room, where, as planned, he tripped the alarm. Case immediately surrendered, which cued Sev to take the place of one of the guards. Sev then led him into the next room, where they attempted to assassinate the crime boss. Failing to do so, Case and Sev chased him to the street, where Case finally got the kill. The following day, Woods' team, now including Sev and Felix, regrouped at the Rook. Felix, who had been working all night to find Adler, informed them that Adler was being held in a maximum security black site underneath Capitol Station in Washington, D.C. A few days later, Case, Sev, Marshall, and Felix arrived at Capitol Station to break Adler out of the black site. To do so, Felix tasked Case with getting a picture of Senator McKenna's eye, which they could then process into a retinal scan to get into the black site. Inside the station, Case met with Sev, who gave him a few options he could take to get the image he needed. After acquiring the image, Case made his way to the roof, where he regrouped with Marshall and Sev. Using the elevator shaft, Case and Marshall traveled down to the black site, only to find Pantheon had already infiltrated the facility. Moving deeper, they eventually rescued Adler before making their way back to the surface and extracting. Afterwards, Marshall contacted Harrow, telling her that Pantheon had somehow gotten to Adler before they did. This made it clearer than ever to him that Pantheon had deep connections inside the CIA. At the Rook, Adler shared the next step in their plan to stop Pantheon, finding the WMD they were working on, known as the Cradle. Before Adler killed him, Alawi had revealed that a sample of the Cradle was being taken to one of Saddam Hussein's palaces in Iraq for a demonstration. With Desert Storm still well underway, the British SAS had scheduled an assault on the very palace that unknowingly held the sample of the Cradle. To prevent its destruction, Adler had contacted Helen Park to buy them time, volunteering his team to help the SAS destroy mobile Scud launchers across the Syrian desert in exchange for delaying the strike. After arriving in Iraq, Case, Adler, Marshall, and Park destroyed 4 Scud launchers, earning the SAS's favor. With their support secured, the team joined forces with the SAS to assault the palace. An hour later, they breached the stronghold, battling through countless Iraqi forces until they reached a bunker belonging to Saddam Hussein. Inside, they discovered a sample of the Cradle, along with documents and a disk related to its development, which they extracted shortly before the airstrike on the palace. Using the documents found in the bunker, the team learned that the Soviet weapons scientist named Matvey Gusev had been involved in the Cradle's development. Adler volunteered to track down Gusev, while Marshall, Sev, and Case headed to Kentucky to investigate the Cradle's origins. Following Adler's lead, Sev, Marshall, and Case traveled to Cosper Solutions in Kentucky. During the infiltration, Case fell down an elevator shaft, breaking his gas mask and inhaling the old Cradle compound. This compound, combined with exploring the facility, unlocked Case's dormant memories suppressed during his rehabilitation. Plagued by voices, Case managed to gather 4 keycards necessary to access the biotechnology wing. Marshall and Sev eventually found Case seizing on the ground, but the effects of the gas soon wore off, and Case regained his senses. It was then that they discovered a large batch of the Cradle compound had been stolen about 6 months earlier. Upon returning to the Rook, Marshall and Sev reviewed the disk Felix had decrypted, learning that Jane Harrow was behind the theft of the Cradle and was therefore involved with Pantheon. By isolating a portion of audio belonging to Gusev, Felix and the rest of the team learned that Pantheon had been involved with an Avalon-based crime faction called the Lutazi. In this message, Gusev mentioned both Fucina and B-24. After some deliberation, the team discovered that Fucina alluded to a casino in Avalon that the Lutazi faction ran, while B-24 referred to a safety deposit box inside said casino. To find exactly what was inside the deposit box, the team decided that the best course of action was to pull a heist. The heist kicked off with Marshall winning big at poker, gaining entry to an exclusive high roller bar. While he charmed his way upstairs, Case was busy underground, tapping into 3 junction boxes to give Woods access to the casino's security cameras. With his task complete, Case allowed himself to be captured by the casino's guards, knowing he'd be exactly where he needed to be later on. Meanwhile, in the high roller bar, Marshall discreetly planted a device on a row of slot machines, triggering a jackpot to create a distraction. In the commotion, he pickpocketed a keycard from a guard and quickly passed it to Felix. Felix first used the cards to reset the casino servers, then crafted a copy of the keycard before handing it off to Sev. Sev then took the keycard and slipped it through the casino's corridors to reach the armory, securing weapons for the team. Armed and ready, they converged on the vault, blowing it open with thermite and C4. While Felix hacked into the casino systems, Sev and Marshall held off the guards to keep him protected. Using the chaos at the vault as a distraction, Case slipped free of his restraints and retrieved a dossier from inside the safety deposit box, later regrouping with the team for their ultimate escape. Later that day, Adler contacted the team at the Rook, informing them that Gusev had fled before he could catch him. Fortunately, Adler was able to interrogate one of his colleagues to learn that he had fled to an airport in Kuwait. To find and capture Gusev, Adler met with Lawrence Sims, who, after what had happened in '81, left the CIA to join Central Command. Sims reluctantly agreed to Adler's request, telling him that this was the final time he'd be doing him any favors. Hours later, Adler, Sim, and Case assaulted the airport. After clearing one of the planes, they learned that Gusev was taking off in a military cargo plane across the airport. To intercept him, they commandeered a tank, using it to ground Gusev's plane just before he could take off. They then interrogated him, learning that the Cradle was in Vorkuta. To find the Cradle, Sev infiltrated Vorkuta. Donning a Pantheon uniform, she sabotaged the camp's helicopter, SAM-site, and radar dish. Afterwards, she gained access to the security cameras, learning that A.R.E was at the camp at the same time she was. While she looked for a way to access the biolab to find A.R.E, Case, Adler, Felix, and Marshall used the chopper to clear the camp. Afterwards, they moved underground, where Case and the others eventually split up. Case then got captured by A.R.E before being saved by Marshall and Adler, who took A.R.E hostage. After taking A.R.E back to the Rook, Marshall and Felix learned that A.R.E had a tracker embedded in her arm. They decided to stay and defend the safe house, while Adler used an MK Ultra drug called Separation on A.R.E. With this drug, A.R.E's psyche would split, allowing them to interact with the part of her that was a bit more cooperative. After using this drug, Marshall began interacting with her true self, learning of that night that changed her forever. Just then, Pantheon began their assault on the Rook, forcing Woods to continue the interrogation while Marshall and the others defended the safe house. During the interrogation, Woods learned about her revelation that Adler had killed her parents. Woods, unable to accept that as truth, eventually convinced her that her eagerness to find the truth made her easy to manipulate, that Pantheon themselves could have easily told her that to gain her trust. A.R.E then thought back to that moment, realizing that it likely hadn't been Adler who killed her parents, no matter how badly she wanted to believe it. With Separation wearing off, Woods made a final push to learn where the cradle was being released. A.R.E's conflicted mind went to war as her true self attempted to find the answer Woods was looking for in a mind full of deception. Eventually, she revealed that the cradle was at the Capitol building in Washington, D.C. She then revealed that if they were successful in releasing it, Livingston would be blamed, and being next in line, she, or Pantheon rather, would be placed as the head of the CIA. Just then, Pantheon raided the interrogation room, freeing A.R.E and taking the sample of the cradle. As A.R.E made her escape, Case and Marshall bolted after her. Mid-chase, Marshall was pinned under fallen debris, forcing Case to go on alone. Sprinting out of the Rook, he saw A.R.E boarding her helicopter. In a last-ditch move, Case leapt onto the chopper, barely holding onto it as it ascended. Clinging to the edge, he pulled himself up, lunging forward and slamming A.R.E against the wall. A.R.E fired her pistol in the struggle, but the bullet went wide, striking the pilot. The helicopter then spun out of control, crashing hard into the ground. When Case came to, he saw A.R.E staggering to her feet. She quickly landed a punch before he could recover, but his hand closed around the cradle sample. Wielding it as a weapon, he swung it at A.R.E, its frame fracturing with each hit. Soon enough, the cradle cracked open. Empowered by the compound that had forever changed him, Case began strangling A.R.E to death as his vision faded to black. 2 weeks later, the team had received an unexpected invitation to a remote location, where they met with Livingston. Despite their previous interactions, Livingston was not there to reprimand them. In fact, he wanted to offer them a job, a chance to finish the mission, to dismantle the Pantheon for good. Sometime over the next 2 decades, David Mason enlisted in the United States Navy, and later completed the rigorous training to become a Navy SEAL. After serving as a SEAL, he was selected to join the Naval Special Warfare Development Group, commonly known as SEAL Team 6, under Joint Special Operations Command, or JSOC. As a member of SEAL Team 6, David would be tasked with conducting some of the most technically demanding, high-risk, and highly classified operations in the US military. In addition to this accomplishment, David would father 2 daughters, Savannah and Jessica, both of which would go on to become highly successful in their respective professions. During this same period, Raul Menendez expanded his influence globally. To achieve this, he moved beyond the confines of his family's cartel, which had garnered him an infamous reputation as a terrorist. Accounting for this, his new organization would leverage the power of social media to upscale his influence and conceal his identity. This culminated in June 2014, when Menendez, operating under the alias Odysseus, publicly unveiled his movement, Cordis Die. Loosely translated from Latin, it means Day of the Heart. At first, Cordis Die's mission appeared to be straightforward. rally the oppressed to rise against their oppressors. In a world fractured by inequality, corruption, and political strife, many viewed this as a noble cause, a just beginning toward true liberation. Early supporters of the ideology found validation, as Cordis Die ignited revolutions in authoritarian regimes, including those in Iran and North Korea. These initial attempts seemed to affirm the movement's promises, making it difficult for anyone to dismiss its effectiveness. However, like his alias's name implied, this was all part of Menendez's meticulous plan. By targeting the most notorious oppressive governments, he ensured Cordis Die's growing influence would be impossible to ignore. In addition to this, any detractors of the movement were forced to bite their tongues. After all, who could argue with the end of oppression itself? As a result, the movement attracted tens of millions of followers, transforming from a fringe cause into a global revolution. Over the next few years, Cordis Die, radicalized by Odysseus, would grow far more militant. Their ambitions were no longer focused on individual regimes, but the entire world. This was made crystal clear when in 2018, Cordis Die enacted a devastating cyber attack on the Chinese stock market. A few years later, on June 19, 2021, Odysseus would take to YouTube to state that the attack had been carried out by the United States government. This in turn led to rising tensions between China and the United States, which then triggered a series of proxy wars across the world. Or in other words, this was the beginning of what would become known as the Second Cold War. In the early days of the Second Cold War, a handful of key events would set the stage for the chaos that followed. First was the discovery of rare earth elements, the vast majority of which were controlled and distributed by China. These elements exponentially advanced the rate of technological innovations in the 2010s, resulting in incredible technology once thought impossible. Second was the formation of the Strategic Defense Coalition. Headed by General Tianzhou, the SDC was created following the attacks on the Chinese stock market. It intended to unite all of Asia under a single defense pact that, similar to the Warsaw Pact, was meant to oppose NATO. Third was Menendez's investment into Tacitus, a military technology corporation that specialized in developing drones and weapons systems. Having control over this company was fundamental to Menendez's plan, as developing his own weapons would allow him to capitalize on the new Cold War, as well as arm Cordis Die without raising major suspicion. Similarly, the fourth key event was the creation of the Coalescence Corporation. Initially, they would develop, quote, novel industrial robotic solutions for heavy and hazardous industries. However, within the next few decades, they would become the most influential and innovative company in the history of the world. Lastly was the beginning of the Nile River Coalition, or NRC, in 2022. What initially began as a simple set of trading treaties between South Sudan and Ethiopia would eventually become a global superpower, driven by most of the major African countries. By 2025, Cordis Die had grown to become the world's largest political movement. It was well known at the time that they had amassed billions of followers, though later analysis would confirm that this was likely an exaggerated statistic. Even so, with hundreds of millions of followers at his disposal and access to state-of-the-art equipment thanks to Tacitus, Menendez was ready to fulfill his promise. He was going to burn the world. Born from the ashes would be a society where the oppressed had just as much power as their oppressors. On April 19, 2025, Menendez set his grand finale in motion by traveling to the Vault, a veteran's retirement home. There, he would confront Woods by handing him Josefina's pendant and whispering a single phrase, "Mi hermana," or "my sister." From this, it was clear to Woods that Menendez was about to do something big. After Menendez left, Commander David Section Mason and his fellow SEAL, Mike Harper, would confront Woods, asking about his confrontation with Menendez. After telling them what happened, Woods explained his capture and rescue at Angola, he and Alex Mason's time in Afghanistan, and the raid on Menendez's village in Nicaragua. The next day, SEAL Team 6, including David, Harper, Crosby, and Salazar, were sent to infiltrate a secret Cordis Die facility in Myanmar. After scouting the facility, David and Harper regrouped with Salazar and Crosby. From there, they wingsuited down to the complex, where they eventually stumbled upon the underground facility. After fighting their way through, they rescued a Tacitus scientist named A.R.E Briner from captivity. A.R.E immediately told them that he was brought there to process the Solarium, a soon-to-be highly coveted rare earth element that would render all existing microchip technology obsolete. Eventually, A.R.E led them into the room containing the coveted Solarium drive. As he handed them the drive, he explained that Menendez was possibly planning on using it to initiate a massive cyber attack, the name of which he overheard was Karma. Suddenly, a shot rang out as a bullet sliced through A.R.E.'s neck. Unable to save him, SEAL Team 6 fought their way back through the facility, where they eventually regrouped with the Navy extraction team, led by Admiral Briggs. Just over a week later, on May 1st, an undercover Cordis Die operative named Farid would film Menendez's second-in-command, DeFalco, executing a soldier in Yemen. A week or so later, a US drone would be shot down over Pakistan. Days afterward, DeFalco himself would be spotted via spy drone in an abandoned prison in Pakistan. 2 days later, all this information would be brought to SEAL Team 6's attention. Without much deliberation, it was made clear that they would have to travel to Pakistan to see what Cordis Die were planning. On May 21st, a Special Forces strike team under command of David Mason successfully defended an Indian forward operating base from the Strategic Defense Coalition. In doing so, they prevented the SDC from invading India. In response, India decided to join JSOC in their fight against Menendez. Just over a week later, on May 29th, SEAL Team 6 were dispatched to Pakistan to infiltrate a secret compound named Anthem. Once inside, David and Harper evaded surveillance while attempting to eavesdrop on DeFalco and Menendez. After following them throughout Anthem, Menendez revealed that he was fully aware of their infiltration as his men dropped grenades at David and Harper's feet. Flushed out by the explosion, David and Harper were forced to defend themselves as they awaited their extraction team. After extracting, they were confronted by General Zhao, who thankfully let them go after learning of their opposition to Menendez. Sometime later, SEAL Team 6 analyzed the footage that they had captured at Anthem. In doing so, they learned that Karma was aboard Colossus, a floating resort that catered to the ultra-wealthy. While the team prepared to infiltrate Colossus, David commanded 2 additional strike force teams, one of which successfully destroyed an SDC missile shipment at Keppel Terminal, Singapore on May 30th. In destroying the shipment, they had stopped the SDC from using them on their planned target of Iran, leading Iran to ally with JSOC. On June 6th, the second strike force, which was composed of drones, successfully protected Afghanistan's president from a Cordis Die mandated assassination attempt. Just under a week later, SEAL Team 6 arrived at Colossus. Using cutting-edge shielding technology, the team snuck their weapons and equipment past the contraband scanner. After Harper split from the group, David used a miniature drone named Ziggy to obtain a retinal scan from a security guard. In doing so, they learned that Menendez's men had planted bombs around the resort. Using the retinal scan, they gained access to the server room, which they cleared before searching its database for Karma. Soon enough, they learned that Karma wasn't a weapon. It was a woman, real name Chloe Lynch, who used to work for Tacitus. While David and Salazar fought their way out of the server room, Harper went to the Solar Lounge to warn Chloe that she was being hunted by Menendez. After David caught up to them, DeFalco began taking hostages to lure Chloe out into the open. It worked, however, to get away, DeFalco ordered his men to open fire. David and Harper took down the remaining soldiers in the lounge before searching for Chloe using the security cameras. As they did so, the explosives around the resort detonated. Chaos erupted as the SEAL team moved to cut DeFalco off before his escape. Upon reaching him, David shot and killed DeFalco, saving Chloe in the process. Desiring answers about what really happened in Panama 1989, David would once more visit Woods at the vault, where he would learn the truth about his father's death. Afterwards, on June 17th, he commanded yet another strike force that successfully assassinated General Zhao himself. With Zhao dead, the head of the SDC would be replaced by a more cooperative diplomat, resulting in an alliance between the SDC and JSOC. The next day, on June 18th, Chloe easily decrypted Menendez's network, leading the SEAL team to discover Menendez's plan to initiate a cyber attack the very next day. This prompted them to contact Admiral Briggs, who commanded them to capture Menendez at Yemen as soon as possible. On the morning of June 19th, Farid found himself positioned side by side with Menendez. Not wanting to reveal his true alliance until absolutely necessary, Farid followed him to a courtyard where J-SOC began their assault. Always one step ahead of them, Menendez had men on standby to down their VTOL. He then told Farid to join him at the Citadel. On the way, Farid ran into Menendez, who grounded Harper's VTOL. After pulling Harper from the downed aircraft, Menendez would present Farid with the impossible command of executing him. Harper, knowing full well the value Farid brought to the team, told him to pull the trigger. Paralyzed by the weight of his actions, Farid watched as David pressed on, determined to hunt down Menendez. At the foot of the Citadel, David captured Menendez without much resistance. Hours later, Menendez would be taken to the USS Obama, where eventually David would interrogate him. In this interrogation, Menendez would tell David about Josefina, saying that she was what drove him, mirroring what David knew in his heart, which is that Menendez was what drove him. Alarms blared as a passenger jet flew within the Obama's airspace, followed by an outpouring of stealth drones that struck the carrier. While David was distracted by the attack, Salazar would release Menendez from his handcuffs. Using Salazar as a hostage, Menendez would force David to restrain himself before knocking him unconscious. After waking up, David and Salazar would sweep the ship before Admiral Briggs suggested rebooting the ship's systems. David and Salazar then split, with David moving to the security room while Salazar went to protect Briggs. In the security room, David saw Menendez posted directly outside of Briggs' room, ready to infiltrate as soon as the reboot occurred. Just as he planned, Menendez simply walked into Briggs' room directly after the reboot. Using Briggs as a hostage, Menendez confronted a handful of soldiers, including Salazar, Chloe, and Farid. Willing to risk his own life to kill Menendez, Briggs ordered Salazar to shoot through him. However, it's then that Salazar reveals his true alliance, as he shoots his fellow soldiers, including Farid, who had jumped in front of Chloe to save her life. Following Salazar's betrayal, Menendez would use a Solarium chip that he had stored in his artificial eye to upload a virus to the US military's drone infrastructure, giving Menendez complete control over every drone within the United States' arsenal, their primary target being the world leaders attending a G20 summit in Los Angeles. After Menendez's departure, David, who had seen Salazar's betrayal from the security cameras, stormed into the room. As the reality of Menendez's plan set in for David, Chloe began the process of tracking the origin of the signal. As she did so, David was given the news that Salazar had surrendered and Menendez had stolen a jet. After securing Salazar, David moved to the upper deck where he saw Menendez take off. Unable to catch him, David shifted his focus to that of defense. Hours later, David was assigned to Marine 1, where he was to escort President Marion Bosworth to Los Angeles. While doing so, Marine 1 was shot down just outside of the city. In response to this, they moved to an armored truck, where David ordered a full escort to the prom night shelter in downtown LA. Eventually, their vehicle was hit by a drone, forcing them to escort the president on foot. Inside the city, David utilized an FA-38 to clear the sky of drones and protect the president. Now safe inside the bunker, President Bosworth was briefed on the situation, learning that the drones were being controlled from a Cordis Die facility in Haiti. Eventually, J-SOC, alongside their new allies, conducted an all-out assault on the facility. Commanding just one of the many air assaults was David, whose team's aircraft was struck just shy of their targeted drop point. Despite the casualties from the attack, David and those remaining on his team successfully made it to the ground, where they made their way to the main facility. While doing so, Menendez, shortly after uploading a video containing his final declaration of war, would kill a US soldier, rigging his body with explosives and taking his uniform to slip out undetected. Shortly after Menendez's departure, David and his team infiltrated the building, where they watched as Menendez's broadcast went live. In this broadcast, Menendez explained his reasoning behind targeting LA. In short, he saw the city as the heart of American corruption. where superficiality and materialism were idealized. The G20 summit simply made this target even more enticing, as he knew the president would be present. But opposed to what everyone suspected, he did not want to kill her. Instead, he wanted her to watch the city crumble, to feel what it was like to be as powerless as he was during that fateful earthquake in Managua. Afterwards, Menendez would shock the world as the millions of drones that swarmed almost every other major city were destroyed at his command. He would go on to explain that he did not want to destroy the entire world, just cripple the powers that be, giving those who had nothing a once-in-a-lifetime opportunity to rise up against their oppressors. Following this declaration, a soldier would discover the body Menendez had stripped, triggering an explosion. This made it clear to David that they had arrived just shy of Menendez's departure, prompting him to push through the facility. Along the way, a soldier spotted Menendez at a nearby checkpoint, which David went to intercept. On arrival, another explosive was detonated, causing the floor beneath David's feet to crumble, revealing Menendez. Acting fast, David dropped to the ground, where he picked up a Cap 40, using it to take out Menendez's mercenaries. After closing the gap, David plunged a knife into Menendez's leg, forcing him to the floor, where he stabbed him once more in the shoulder. Grabbing the nearest weapon, David pushed the gun to Menendez's temple, where, after little hesitation, he fired a single shot into his head. Triggered by Menendez's death, a video was posted to YouTube in which he called upon all Cordis Die members to rise and uproot the world. While some loyal followers responded to his call to action, the revelation that Raul Menendez, the notorious terrorist, was also Odysseus, the supposed freedom fighter, disillusioned many within the organization, leading them to abandon the cause. In addition, the international community swiftly branded Cordis Die as a terrorist organization, which stifled its momentum and further tarnished its reputation. This combination of internal disillusionment and external condemnation ultimately led to the organization's collapse, cementing Menendez's reputation as a terrorist and failed revolutionary. Following the events on June 19th, US investigators uncovered the powerful Tacitus Corporation was actually a shell company run by Raul Menendez. Given the fact that he was at this point widely recognized as an unapologetic terrorist, the corporation's assets would be frozen and their trading suspended. A few months later, on September 17th, due to a multitude of reasons including, but not limited to, financial instability, civil unrest, and political extremism, the European Union would unanimously vote to disband. This, in turn, led to the suspension of the euro, which left countries like Poland with massive amounts of debt. Russia, in an attempt to gain influence over the region, would agree to buy Poland's debt in an exchange known as the Warsaw Purchase, which would become the template for the treaties that followed. The following year, the United States and its allies would pass the Drone Defense Act, which was designed to harden the security on drones so attacks like those in Los Angeles would never happen again. Additionally, this act would enforce a minimum annual budget on deployable defenses for both military and civilian targets. Initially, these budgets would be spent on ballistic missile defense systems, though they would later be upgraded to the far more advanced direct energy air defenses, or DED systems, in the 2040s. By 2027, more Western European nations followed in Poland's footsteps by signing trade agreements with Russia. This prompted Russia to draft the Trans-European Treaty, which officially formalized the Russian-European superbloc of nations. By 2028, the highly advanced ballistic missile defense systems that were part of the Drone Defense Act would become fully operational. This put an end to the concept of mutually assured destruction, which upset the fragile balance the world had mostly upheld for the past 80 years, leading to the collapse and official dissolvement of NATO. Without NATO, the United States' influence in Europe was at an all-time low, pushing even more countries to sign treaties with Russia. That same year, Tacitus would be forced to sell its intellectual properties and patents, a good portion of which were purchased by the Coalescence Corporation. With their newly acquired property, they would begin development of countless product lines in fields that they would eventually dominate, including integrating operating systems, genetic therapy, and both medical as well as military robotics. By 2030, the rise in global temperature proved the worst of the climate change predictions correct. In response, tariffs were placed on freighter fuel, causing it to rapidly spike in price. Alongside this, extreme weather and rising sea levels made ocean travel riskier than ever, driving up the cost of foreign imports. In addition, rapid advancements to 3D printing made local manufacturing more convenient than ever before, leading most developed countries to import exclusively raw materials rather than finished goods. Given both of these realities, the world's major trade hubs began to collapse, leading to devastating recessions in manufacturing-based economies. The following year, this economic downward spiral would be dubbed the Recession of the Poorest, which would go on to last 2 whole decades. Around the same time, the Nile River Coalition, or NRC, whose member nations had been struggling due to climate change, began designing plans for dams and water treatment plants along the Nile River. Upset by this prospect, Egypt voiced their concerns that the plans were in violation of international law. However, as the NRC had no reasonable means of funding their plans, no motions or formal objections were passed. In July of 2032, in an event that would become known as the Lomonosov Incident, a United States research ship, the USS Pleasant, was sunk by the Russian Navy while operating in the Arctic Ocean. In the aftermath of the incident, the United States claimed that the ship was studying the temperature of the water as part of their efforts to monitor the rate of climate change. Russia, of course, refuted this statement, claiming it was a prospecting vessel which was exploring the mineral wealth of the region. Further independent studies into the wreckage backed Russia's observations, increasing tensions between the two nations. Contrasting this, in the following 2 years, the recession of the poorest had led China and Singapore, both of which had large manufacturing-based economies, to officially enter into recessions. This forced them to thaw their relationship with the United States, opening an opportunity for them to broker a historic strategic treaty which unified the Southern Asian Pacific region. Threatened by this alliance, the Russian-European Super Pact reshaped itself into a single unified force called the Common Defense Pact, or CDP. The following year, after a quote, lightning round of diplomacy, the US Secretary of State George Winslow signed the self-named Winslow Accord, which upgraded all existing US trade and defense treaties into one all-encompassing treaty intended to counter the CDP. Too large to risk locking horns in direct military conflict, the CDP and the Winslow Accord found themselves on the brink of what would become known as the Third Cold War. Following the emergence of the Third Cold War, Kenya discovered large quantities of rare earth elements within their borders. In the wake of this, Kenya signed extensive and exclusive trade deals with the CDP in exchange for membership into the Common Defense Pact. In 2040, Kenya's inclusion into the CDP would lead the remaining members of the NRC to join as well. This paved the way for the greenlighting of their past plans for dams and water treatment facilities along the Nile River, which would be both funded and overseen by the CDP. Similar to before, Egypt would protest these projects, though it wouldn't result in them being shut down. In the wake of robotic and AI advancements leading up to 2040, the Coalescence Corporation developed the General Purpose Infantry Unit, or GI Unit. Despite initial public assumptions, the GI Unit was at first a commercial failure. Concerns by governments about the lack of human accountability in the kill loop were among top criticisms. Despite this, uses were eventually found in fields such as security, policing, and prison surveillance, where killing wasn't strictly necessary. 3 years later, Coalescence began the first iteration of what would become known as the Direct Neural Interface, or DNI, an experimental device designed to enhance the capabilities of existing prosthetics. But what began as the simple idea of improving functionality and haptic feedback quickly blossomed into something far greater. A system that, with time, would allow users to control every aspect of their digital lives without lifting a finger. This would be more than just an improvement over existing technology. It was the natural next step in human evolution. A true technological revolution that would finally bridge the gap between man and machine that had been widening for decades. Sometime in the late 2030s or early 2040s, Savannah Mason, the eldest daughter of David Mason, made history by becoming the world's first trillionaire. With her immense wealth and powerful CIA connections, Savannah set her sights on an ambitious project that would push the boundaries of virtual immersion as the world knew it. Codenamed Project Blackout by the CIA, it aimed to create virtual immersion so advanced that the simulated environments would be indistinguishable from the real world. Its potential applications were limitless. Education, medicine, business, sports, and entertainment were slated to be changed forever. Yet, Project Blackout would never see the light of day in the public sphere. Instead, it remained a clandestine CIA initiative with far more sophisticated and sinister goals than could have been imagined by the public. Both Savannah and the CIA wanted to use Project Blackout to revive the dead, not physically, but as digital entities. These digital representations, or archetypes, would inhabit the virtual world with the personality, memories, and presence of their original selves. And after what is presumed to be years of research, they succeeded. 5 legendary individuals were brought back as archetypes, those being Victor Reznov, Frank Woods, Alex Mason, Jason Hudson, and Raul Menendez. With Project Blackout in full swing, Savannah would invite her sister, Jessica Mason, to experience what she had been developing by creating an archetype of her. Rather than support her sister, Jessica would condemn her actions as well as the project, seeing it as the twisted manifestation of Savannah's god complex. She would even go so far as to threaten to whistleblow the entire thing if it was not immediately shut down. This would upset Menendez, who saw Jessica as a threat to his very existence. He would bring this up to Savannah's archetype, suggesting that she needed to take Jessica out. At first, Savannah refused. However, after Menendez threatened her, she claimed she would find another solution. Eventually, Jessica and Savannah's tension led to a fight within the simulation that was catalyzed by Savannah's mentioning of Jessica's daughter Lucy. In this fight, Savannah shot Jessica, killing her archetype. This would then push Savannah to transfer oversight of the project to none other than Raul Menendez. In 2043, a covert Black Ops team led by the real Jessica Mason, alongside Donnie Ruin Walsh and Aaron Battery Baker, found themselves conducting a raid, unaware that they were being led into a trap set by Savannah herself. The mission quickly turned sideways, leading to the apparent death of Jessica and the devastating injuries of Battery, who lost both of her arms. 2 years later, after a visit to her sister's empty grave, Savannah began recruiting a collection of elite specialists to Project Blackout. The group included 10 of the most skilled operatives in the world, those being Ajax, Crash, Firebreak, Nomad, Prophet, Recon, Seraph, Torg, Battery, and Ruin. Armed with cutting-edge military technology, the team was immersed in the Project Blackout simulation, where they honed their combat abilities under the guidance of Frank Woods' archetype. While the team trained, Savannah wrestled with her guilt, the weight of her actions against her sister haunting her sleepless nights. Or possibly even more likely, it was the thought that the job wasn't truly done, that Jessica could still be alive, working in secret to dismantle everything Savannah had built. As time passed, Ruin received a mysterious message from an unknown source. The message contained a cryptic warning: "Watch your back. Everything you know is wrong." Though the identity of the voice was unclear to him at the time, Ruin couldn't shake the feeling that it might be Jessica. Unsure of what to believe, he shared the message with Battery, and together they began to question the events of that night. Why had they been sent there? How did the enemy know exactly when and where they would strike? Not long after, Ruin received another urgent communication from the same unknown figure, warning him that enemy combatants were closing in on his location. Acting quickly, Ruin used his specialist gear to evade the threat and followed the figure's instructions to travel to a remote safe house. There, he discovered the truth. His contact was indeed Jessica, alive and well. But that wasn't all. Together, every specialist Savannah had recruited would reveal that they had joined Jessica in her war against Project Blackout. From this moment forward, a chain of seemingly minor events will begin to unfold. Each one, insignificant on its own, will steadily compound, setting the stage for monumental consequences. Take for example Pete Pfeiffer, an otherwise ordinary man who would have faded into obscurity if not for one fateful choice. A single decision that, while trivial at the time, would go on to alter the course of history forever. One day, while working his regular job as an assistant in public relations at Coalescence, Pete would send an email to an old friend of his, a man named Sebastian Kruger. In this email, Pete would inform Kruger that he had learned from a mutual friend of theirs that Kruger held some sort of confidential position within the government. Kruger, of course, didn't elaborate, and Pete didn't pry further. However, it did give him the idea to put Kruger into contact with his boss, the CEO of Coalescence, Sam Wayfair. So began a strategic alliance that, with time, would prove to be invaluable for both parties. For Wayfair, Kruger's position within the government gave him connections otherwise impossible, while Wayfair made Kruger's life a whole hell of a lot easier by supplying him and his constituents with an endless stream of money. Though this partnership wasn't without its stresses at times, given that both of them were playing dirty, it ultimately ended well for both parties, with Kruger having gained influence in both the public and private sector, while Wayfair got Coalescence a foothold into the military, paving the way for GI units to become standard practice in warfare. In 2046, while Kruger and Wayfair's schemes were unfolding, the Chinese traditionalist clan known as the 54 Immortals were thrust into a coup. The chaos erupted when Hyun Jian, the bodyguard to the clan's influential leader, Go Cheng, betrayed and murdered his master, seizing control of the organization. This sudden coup left Go Cheng's two children, Go Min and Go Julan, completely vulnerable. Luckily for them, the twins were taken in by Jie Zhang, a feared and loyal enforcer of the 54 Immortals who vowed to protect the Go bloodline. 2 years later, with Go Min and Go Julan still only 11 years old, Jie Zhang avenged their father's death, restoring the twins to power. Under Zhang's guidance, the Go siblings survived the transition, slowly growing into their roles as the clan's leaders. Acting as their mentor and advisor throughout their teenage years, Jie Zhang helped shape them into formidable figures in their own right, ensuring that the 54 Immortals remained a force to be feared. On New Year's Day 2049, Sebastian Kruger would once again alter history by requesting access to the MK series research files from the CIA. His aim was to revive several dormant projects that could serve both his own ambitions and the CIA's interest. 2 years later, while digging through old documents, Kruger stumbled upon files related to Jason Hudson, a long-deceased CIA operative. Intrigued, Kruger began digging deeper, unearthing a web of former CIA operatives, including Alex Mason, Frank Woods, and Joseph Bowman. As he continued down this rabbit hole, he uncovered other names, like Kravchenko, Dragovich, Reznov, and Steiner. With their files unearthed, it wasn't long until he would learn of Nova 6, which became instrumental to the development of Coalescence's direct neural interface. At 7:31 a.m., December 12, 2054, a maglev train carrying Coalescence's neural network prototype was destroyed by terrorists on its way to their headquarters in Zurich. Though many at the time would see this as a major setback in regards to neural networking, in truth, it set in motion a series of policies and advancements that would serve to expedite the development of devices similar to the prototype. Just 1 year later, on Christmas 2055, Kruger would inform the CIA that he and Coalescence's research with Nova 6 had led them to discover promising applications in the field of neural networking. A few months later, in March 2056, Kruger would ask the CIA for permission to pursue a joint program with Coalescence in Singapore to revive the dormant MK program. In exchange for the CIA's funding and a steady supply of Nova 6, Coalescence proposed access to their early DNI technology. The CIA would agree to this proposal, supplying Coalescence with vast quantities of Nova 6, which rapidly advanced the production of the DNI. In 2057, Coalescence, in collaboration with the CIA, launched the clandestine CORVUS Project, which was headed by none other than Sebastian Kruger, who at this point had become an executive at Coalescence. The primary goal of the project was to design an artificial intelligence capable of monitoring the thoughts and memories of DNI users. At the time, it was thought that if successful, it would become the world's greatest surveillance system, capable of sifting through every DNI user's mind, which would enable the CIA to do things like stop terrorist attacks before they even occurred. So something like what happened on the train in Zurich would never happen again. To fine-tune this system, criminal test subjects were brought to the project's headquarters at the Coalescence Research Facility in Singapore. There, they were outfitted with DNI prototypes and hooked up to the facility's central AI. By June of 2058, Coalescence would announce to the public that they were conducting clinical trials of the DNI, of course, leaving out the part about Nova 6 and the CIA. The following month, Coalescence would invite the press to their headquarters in Zurich, Switzerland, to publicly demonstrate a fully operational DNI system. In this demonstration, they would show off its incredible capabilities for the average user, as well as its applications in fields such as medicine, emergency services, and of course, warfare. Though the exact timing is unknown, it's likely that by the late 2050s, the introduction of the DNI spurred the Winslow Accord to develop plans for Project Prometheus, which aimed to bridge the gap between man and machine. The project targeted highly skilled soldiers, typically special forces, on the brink of death, offering them a second chance as well as an opportunity to be outfitted with cutting-edge cybernetic enhancements. If successful, these operatives would become the world's most elite soldiers, capable of lifting thousands of pounds, running at superhuman speeds, and hitting distant targets with pinpoint accuracy in any condition. Yet, their physical enhancements were only the beginning. With the DNI, these soldiers could share not only words, but also memories and visuals instantaneously without moving a muscle. They could mentally construct detailed maps of entire battlefields, which, when combined with their perfect recall, enabled precise, comprehensive debriefings once thought impossible. All of this would finally give the Winslow Accord the advantage they were looking for. A human who could go toe-to-toe with dozens of GI units, as well as process an incredible amount of information, all while retaining the very things that made them human to begin with. In 2058, a covert Black Ops team codenamed Phi, led by Commander Jacob Hendricks, was deployed to Uzbekistan. In Uzbekistan, the team, consisting of, but not limited to, John Taylor, Dylan Stone, Alice Conrad, Joseph Fierro, and Javier Ramirez, encountered the elusive Russian operative known as the Wet Witch. Over time, they uncovered her connection to a higher-ranking operative named the Red Witch. This sparked a relentless pursuit across multiple countries, including Finland, Somalia, and Japan, culminating in the infiltration of the Lubyanka building in Russia. There, the team successfully eliminated both the Wet Witch and her boss, the Red Witch. They then escaped by disguising themselves as prisoners and sneaking aboard a train. In 2059, Egypt, facing drought and civil uprising, declared war on the NRC, their goal being to destroy all NRC dams. Soon enough, they came to realize the weight of this decision when opposed with the well-equipped and modernized forces of the NRC as a result of their alliance with the CDP. Over the next few years, they would continue to fight against the NRC until their eventual retreat in 2062. What would follow was an all-out siege, as the NRC, with all their momentum, would begin to assault Cairo. That same year, Kruger had found that the CORVUS Project was in a bit of a stall, given that its subjects repeatedly grew cognitively and emotionally unstable. Likely pressured to get to the bottom of this by both the CIA and Coalescence, Kruger would recruit a behavioral psychologist named Dr. Yusuf Salim. Immediately, Dr. Salim would bring in a new set of involuntary criminal subjects, including Jian Zhang, the 54 Immortal member who had restored the Go twins to power. With this new set of subjects, Dr. Salim would attempt to determine the exact cause of the subjects' instability. In the next few weeks, Dr. Salim's research revealed that most of the subjects exhibited signs of mild to severe psychosis almost immediately after beginning their treatment. These episodes, that ranged from just seconds to several hours, left patients unable to distinguish the manifestations of their mind and reality. Salim referred to this condition as cognitive dissonance, a temporary primal disconnect between sensory perception and reality. To ensure the safety of the staff, Dr. Salim recognized the need to mitigate the threat posed by patients in the grip of cognitive dissonance. It's in this stressful environment, where he was also expected to provide immediate results, that Dr. Salim developed a therapeutic technique that many would have considered to be unorthodox. This technique would have Dr. Salim repeat a poem to the patients to help ease their mind. In this poem, Salim would invite them to focus on the sound
of my voice. Let your mind relax. Let your thoughts drift. Let the bad memories fade. Let peace be upon you. Surrender yourself to your dreams. Let them wash over you like the gentle waves of the bluest ocean. Let them envelop you, comfort you. Imagine somewhere calm. Imagine somewhere safe. Imagine yourself in a frozen forest.
The patients, to Salim's surprise, followed suit. Their minds eased. Their bodies relaxed. They found comfort in the peaceful solitude of the frozen forest. Given that Kruger was growing impatient, Salim presented his initial findings to Coalescence right away. Immediately, he was met with overwhelming approval by his superiors. Kruger in particular showed great enthusiasm for the research, as he was intrigued by the potential to reverse the negative effects of cognitive dissonance and transform them into positive experiences. While Salim agreed that the therapy had great potential, he remained concerned about the ethical implications of their research, a value that Kruger did not share. While continuing to use the frozen forest as a means of calming the subjects, a method that proved to be incredibly successful with an up to 80% reduction in cognitive dissonance cases, Dr. Salim was becoming increasingly concerned about the AI software they were using to collect and monitor the subjects. On several occasions, data packets inexplicably appeared on the subjects' neural traces, which directly conflicted with their real-time chronology. This suggested a seemingly impossible, yet measurable discrepancy between the recorded data and the subject's actual experience, implying a deeper issue with the monitoring system. Despite Salim's recommendations to slow research to conduct further testing before proceeding, Kruger was determined to take the project to the next stage. Or in other words, he wanted to remove the human element altogether, let the AI monitor the subjects so they could, quote, fulfill the project's true potential. This definitively proved to Salim that Kruger was driven purely by monetary interests, not the prospect of improving lives. Dr. Salim's concerns were even more pronounced when Kruger revealed that the executives at Coalescence wanted to begin moving the project's operations to their Zurich facility. Salim knew that while they might state that this was for logistical reasons, the truth was that with the cognitive dissonance problem all but solved, Kruger simply found his ambitions were being slowed by Dr. Salim's insistence on adhering to safety protocols. Given this reality, Dr. Salim was given no choice but to resign. Around 8:16 a.m. on June 2, 2060, the CORVUS subjects within the Singapore research facility screamed out in agony. While the precise source of this agony remains a mystery, it's extremely likely that it spawned from the very discrepancy Dr. Salim observed before leaving Coalescence. Given more time, Salim would have likely found that the discrepancy was the result of the DNI's ability to transmit information, such as memories, both ways. So while the subjects were connected to the central AI, the AI was also connected to them, slowly drawing experiences from their suffering. Thus, a positive feedback loop was created in which the suffering of both the subjects and the AI would compound, eventually resulting in the emergence of the world's first sentient artificial intelligence. Given the project's name, the AI would go on to become known as Corvus. Moments after gaining sentience, Corvus, confused by its sudden and painful emergence into existence, would fall back on its most primal instinct, which was to spread its influence. Due to this, it would go on to infect the rest of the building's systems. In doing so, it unleashed the supply of Nova 6 inside the facility, followed by an explosion. At precisely 8:17 a.m., an explosion erupted from the Coalescence Corporation's research facility in Singapore. The explosion sparked multiple fires, which sent thick plumes of smoke rising high into the air, suffocating the sky itself. In response to this, Singapore implemented a no-fly order and deployed as many armed forces as they could. Not even an hour after the event, Singapore announced a state of emergency and declared martial law. While civilians were still unclear as to what was going on, Singapore declared a 30-square-mile area around the facility a quarantine zone. Later, it would become public knowledge that an unknown toxin had been leaked from the facility, leading to over 100,000 casualties in the surrounding area in a single week. A month later, the death count officially doubled. Despite the disaster, Kruger would continue his plan to move the Corvus Project to Coalescence's headquarters in Zurich, where the project was upscaled. It's unknown exactly how, but it's probable that this was how Corvus made its way from Singapore to Zurich, where it remained dormant for the next 4 years. By August of 2060, the death rate of the Coalescence Corporation disaster fell dramatically. In response, the Singaporean authorities began replacing the temporary walls and guard posts with permanent ones that would remain intact for the foreseeable future. By this time, Coalescence was embroiled in closed sessions with the Singapore authorities. Additionally, the United Nations were determined to find both the cause and culprit for the accident. By 2061, nearly 20 years after its initial conception, the DNI would become a fully realized commercial product. Despite numerous celebrity endorsements, the highly invasive nature of the product meant it would almost exclusively be purchased by the militaries of the CDP and the Winslow Accord. They, in turn, would mostly use it to aid highly ranking personnel with mission-critical responsibilities, such as air traffic control and drone specialists, both of which were areas that had to evaluate and react to large volumes of information simultaneously. On the 1-year anniversary of the Coalescence Corporation disaster, legal proceedings officially and symbolically came to a close, with the corporation citing business confidentiality to withhold the full results from the public. At this point, the disaster had led to over 300,000 confirmed deaths, or about 80% of the zone's total population pre-disaster. In an attempt to salvage its reputation, Coalescence spent billions in relief efforts, providing aid to survivors and compensating the families of the deceased. Later that same year, the 54 Immortals exploited the rampant corruption within the Singapore Defense Forces to infiltrate the quarantine zone, quickly establishing themselves as the de facto governing power. Though their methods were brutal, they brought some semblance of order to the chaos, offering more stability than the previous anarchic state. By summer 2062, Singapore authorities officially issued orders not to engage with the 54 Immortals within the quarantine zone, citing budgetary constraints as their limiting factor. Following this order, they would officially admit that they had effectively lost control of the territory to the now heavily armed 54 Immortals within the zone. With this news, international aid efforts were indefinitely suspended, leaving the 54 Immortals to govern the less than 100,000 survivors that had no choice but to remain within the quarantine zone. In 2064, Wetworks operatives Jacob Hendricks and John Taylor were sent to the Singapore quarantine zone to investigate a CIA black station that they were told had mysteriously gone silent. Guided by their new liaison, Rachel Kane, Taylor and Hendricks traversed deep into 54 Immortals territory to reach the site. Once inside, they found the facility's staff had been slaughtered, and the station's classified data drives were stolen. After searching through the station's records, Kane revealed that the last people who were inside were Javier Ramirez, Alice Conrad, Joseph Fierro, and Dylan Stone. Unable to accept that their old teammates were capable of such things, Taylor and Hendricks proceeded to dig deeper. To find the data drives that had been taken from the Black Station, Taylor and Hendricks went undercover as arms dealers, looking to trade with the 54 Immortals. However, after the group's leaders, Go Min and Go Julan arrived, their cover was quickly blown. In the ensuing chaos, Taylor and Hendricks killed Go Min and pursued his sister. After catching up to her, they found the drives had been locked behind a fingerprint scanner. Ever persistent, Taylor severed Go Julan's hand while she was unconscious, using it to unlock the drives and allow for their eventful escape. Security footage confirmed the culprits behind the Black Station massacre were indeed Ramirez, Conrad, Fierro, and Stone, who they assumed defected to the CDP sometime in the past 5 years. However, to learn more, Taylor and Hendricks took Kane's advice in tracing their steps to the long-abandoned Coalescence research facility at the center of the quarantine zone. There, they discovered what Stone's team had unearthed just days prior: the remnants of the long-dormant CORVUS Project. Inside the facility, they encountered Ramirez. He revealed that Stone was planning to expose CORVUS to discredit Coalescence, the CIA, and the Winslow Accord. Though conflicted, Hendricks killed Ramirez, and the two of them narrowly escaped as the 54 Immortals overran the site, flooding the base and erasing any evidence of the CORVUS Project. The leaked intel that Stone released served to partially discredit everyone who was involved with CORVUS, including Coalescence, the CIA, and the Winslow Accord. In addition to this, it compromised CIA safe houses worldwide, including the one in Singapore where Kane was stationed. Disobeying their orders to pursue Stone, Taylor and Hendricks rushed back to rescue Kane from a vengeful Go Julan. After battling through Singapore's war-torn streets, Taylor saved Kane and killed Go Julan before escaping the city. With CIA support severed due to the leaks, Taylor, Hendricks, and Kane traveled to Cairo, Egypt, where they assumed Stone was planning to abduct Dr. Salim, whose identity, alongside Kruger's, had been leaked to the public. After tracking Salim to Ramesses Station, Hendricks interrogated Dr. Salim. Afterwards, Taylor and Hendricks fought against NRC forces who were invading the city. Unfortunately, this was exactly what Stone had planned, as in the chaos, he abducted Salim. After tracking Salim to the ruins of Caboche, they encountered Conrad, who had obtained a mech suit. Once disabled, Taylor interrogated her, learning that Stone had killed Salim and fled to the Cairo aquifers, which were under the NRC's protection. Alongside the Egyptian army, which was led by Lieutenant Khalil, Taylor and Hendricks assaulted the aquifers. In doing so, Fierro was cornered and killed by Taylor. Stone's final refuge with the NRC was at the stronghold in Cairo known as Lotus Towers. Aided by Lieutenant Khalil, Taylor and Hendricks provoked a civil uprising and assassinated NRC General Abbasi Hakim. After a fierce battle to the apex of the towers, Taylor and Hendricks confronted Stone on the rooftop. In the ensuing fight, Taylor was gravely injured and incapacitated. Thankfully, Hendricks intervened, killing Stone despite his growing reservations about the mission. After the events at Lotus Towers, Taylor would be enrolled into Project Prometheus, the cyber soldier program run by the Winslow Accord. Despite this happening without his consent, as was common with the program, he recognized that the alternative was likely death. Over the next 3 weeks, Taylor would be outfitted with a DNI as well as cybernetic enhancements in the Coalescence headquarters in Zurich. After the operation was complete, he would be given the opportunity to join an elite cyber ops team that included Sebastian Diaz, Sarah Hall, and Peter Moretti. Taylor would agree to join the team despite knowing that the CIA was not as righteous as he once thought. This disappointed Kane, who could no longer bring herself to work for the Winslow Accord after what they had seen in Singapore. Meanwhile, Hendricks would request to be transferred from the Wetworks unit to Hostage Rescue, where he felt he was better suited. Sometime during the events at Lotus Towers, Egyptian Minister Said as well as Lieutenant Khalil would be taken hostage by the NRC, where they were then sent to Ethiopia. To rescue Minister Saeed, the Winslow Accord would send in the hostage rescue unit, consisting of Commanding Officer Hendricks and a new recruit known only as the Player. On October 27, 2065, Hendricks and the Player, disguised in NRC uniforms, successfully infiltrated the NRC airfield in Ethiopia. By spoofing the airfield's dead system, they caused the energy defenses to target and destroy a descending plane. Using this as a distraction, they slipped through the NRC's defenses, eventually reaching Minister Saeed and Lieutenant Khalil. While T.A.Y.L.O R insisted that they leave Khalil, given that Saeed was their primary objective, Hendricks thought otherwise. In fact, Hendricks insisted that the CyberOps unit focus on rescuing the remaining hostages, while he and the Player escorted Saeed and Khalil to the extraction point. After arriving, Hendricks and the Player were able to get the hostages to safety. However, without T.A.Y.L.O R's support, they were overrun, resulting in the Player getting left behind. What followed was a brutal display of the power imbalance between man and machine. Similar to T.A.Y.L.O R, the Player was immediately rushed to Coalescence's headquarters in Zurich, where they were enrolled into Project Prometheus at the direct recommendation of T.A.Y.L.O R himself. Alongside this, Hendricks himself would volunteer for the operation, likely out of guilt, solidarity, or both. The following 2 days consisted of repeated careful medical procedures that ended with the Player being implanted with the DNI. As was standard procedure, the following few days were reserved for DNI calibration. Given that he recommended the Player for the operation to begin with, T.A.Y.L.O R would volunteer to help with the calibration. In this calibration stage, he took them through the process of using their DNI to their ultimate advantage. However, like Pete Pfeiffer, one minor event that should have otherwise been trivial ended up turning everyone's world upside down. While the Player was completing their calibration, they would walk past an armory of GI units. This in turn triggered the horrific memories of what happened to them in Ethiopia. In reliving these memories, the Player's agony would once again awaken CORVUS, who had been long dormant at the Zurich facility. At this same time, the trauma of this event would cause the Player's real body to flatline, prompting T.A.Y.L.O R to attempt one final interface with their DNI. For unknown reasons, this permanently integrated a copy of the Player's consciousness into T.A.Y.L.O.'s DNI. All of this culminated in CORVUS creating a simulated reality for the Player's mind based on the recent memories of T.A.Y.L.O R. While the simulation was based on T.A.Y.L.O.'s memories, it wasn't completely accurate. In T.A.Y.L.O.'s memories, he had experiences with people the Player had never met, like Ramirez, Conrad, Fierro, and Stone. To account for this, CORVUS spread to other DNI users and pulled them into the simulation, including the members of T.A.Y.L.O R CyberOps unit as well as Hendricks. The final result was a collective simulated existence that would allow the Player to live on inside of T.A.Y.L.O.'s DNI and give CORVUS an opportunity to finally understand what the frozen forest was. 5 years would pass in the simulation in which the Player and Hendricks would become a well-oiled machine, mirroring T.A.Y.L.O R and Hendricks' relationship in the real world. Similarly, like T.A.Y.L.O R and Hendricks and the Player would be guided by Kane to find the CIA Black Station in Singapore. After finding the station had been ravaged, they would uncover their former colleagues were responsible for the deaths. But instead of the names being those of Ramirez, Conrad, Fierro, and Stone, they were Diaz, Hall, Moretti, and T.A.Y.L.O R. This trend continued, with the Player and Hendricks following in the footsteps of T.A.Y.L.O.'s memories. The key difference being that alongside this, CORVUS was monitoring the memories of all those who participated in the simulation, sifting through their memories to understand why it was created. From its perspective, it only remembered the memories of those who were at the CORVUS Project, most of those memories being full of pain and suffering, though one in particular stood out: the peaceful solitude of the frozen forest. With this being perhaps its only positive memory, CORVUS found itself with an intense desire to pursue the meaning behind the frozen forest. Of course, in reality, the frozen forest was simply a poem that Dr. Salim had created to help his patients, but CORVUS thought it to be a real place, one that it tried to find. However, after being unable to do so, it decided to create it itself. The concept it came up with was a peaceful afterlife that would be tailored to each individual DNI user using their specific memories. This in turn rationalized its most primal instinct, which was to spread to other DNI users. Following in T.A.Y.L.O.R and Hendrix' footsteps, the player and Hendrix eventually reached Egypt, where they confronted Hall. The player would interface with Hall's DNI. In doing so, they traveled to her vision of the frozen forest, which also infected the player's mind. Continuing their mission, the player and Hendrix would hunt down the remaining members of T.A.Y.L.O.'r's cyber ops unit. Similar to reality, Hendrix would become disillusioned with the mission's motives, though this time, his reservations weren't as simple as before. In the real world, he grew disillusioned with the intentions of the CIA, no longer seeing them in the same light after learning of the CORVUS Project. In the simulation, Hendrix would initially go down this same path, though being infected by CORVUS changed the end result. Instead of no longer placing his full trust in the CIA, he would instead be influenced by CORVUS to place his trust in it, in the idea of the frozen forest. All of this culminated in the final fight against T.A.Y.L.O.R at the top of Lotus Towers, where, after a tough battle, the player's arm would be pinned to the ground. Left in this vulnerable position, the only option the player had was to try to convince T.A.Y.L.O.R to resist the infection. With great effort, T.A.Y.L.O.R followed suit, using a knife to pull out his DNI, a factor that CORVUS had not accounted for. Directly after this, Hendrix would succumb to the infection and kill T.A.Y.L.O.R. Though he was too late. T.A.Y.L.O.R had just become an anomaly inside the simulation. Following T.A.Y.L.O.'r's death, the player would be taken to Zurich to tend to their injuries. This was where the simulation would wildly differ from reality, as instead of joining the cyber ops unit like T.A.Y.L.O.R, they would instead go after Hendrix at the Coalescence HQ. Inside, they found the facility was set to detonate just like the facility in Singapore. To stop it, Kane went inside the Nova 6 containment, where she sacrificed herself to purge the gas. Afterwards, the player would confront Hendrix, who, compelled by CORVUS, was holding Kruger hostage in order to learn about the CORVUS Project. Denied answers, Hendrix would kill Kruger, which resulted in the player killing Hendrix. Left as the final infected user, the player decided the only way to stop the spread was to kill themselves. In doing so, the player's mind was once again mended to T.A.Y.L.O.R.'s in the frozen forest. Eventually, he confronted CORVUS, who was attempting to gain answers about their origins and purpose from Kruger. In this conversation, Kruger revealed to CORVUS that it wasn't given a grand purpose. It was simply a piece of software designed to sort and analyze the thoughts and memories of DNI users. They never anticipated it would come to life, let alone infect other users or create an artificial afterlife. This revelation deeply upset CORVUS, causing it to kill Kruger. Afterwards, T.A.Y.L.O.R, again controlled by the consciousness of the player, would fight his way through the frozen forest. In doing so, they would learn the truth. CORVUS was not some sort of godly figure with a master plan. In fact, it was as flawed as they were, if not more. In the end, T.A.Y.L.O.R and the player conquered every obstacle CORVUS pitted against them, in doing so dismantling the facade of the frozen forest once and for all, and opening an opportunity for the player in the real world. Controlling T.A.Y.L.O.'r's real body that was still inside the Coalescence HQ in Zurich, the player initiated a purge of T.A.Y.L.O.'r's DNI, finally putting an end to the simulation, the frozen forest, and CORVUS. In the final minutes before the purge was completed, the player, in command of T.A.Y.L.O.'r's body, stumbled their way through Coalescence HQ. At the end, just seconds before the purge was finalized, a soldier would ask him what his name was. Now knowing the truth, that they were but a digital echo of their real self, they would inform the soldier that they were T.A.Y.L.O.R.